Chapter 644. If it had been before Tian Mo's realm had fallen, it would have been obvious that Tian Mo had the upper hand. It was very likely that he would have completely crushed Luo Fan's palm in this attack, or even counterattacked and reversed the situation, causing Luo Fan to suffer the fate of defeat and death. But it was clear that this kind of if did not exist. Compared to Luo Fan, Tian Mo's current strength was much stronger than Luo Fan's due to the accumulation of hundreds of millions of years, and his will was not any weaker than Luo Fan's. However, his realm of the zenith heaven was far inferior to Luo Fan's. The realm was the most crucial point among the three. The lack of realm required at least 10,000 times more willpower and 10,000 times more power to completely make up for it. Although Tian Mo's willpower and power were stronger than Luo Fan's, they could not be 10,000 times stronger. Therefore, under the crushing pressure of the palm, all of Tian Mo's resistance was like snow meeting the sun, melting extremely quickly. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan's palm had already directly hit Tian Mo's body. Although Tian Mo's body, which had been refined for an unknown number of millions of years, had almost reached a stage where nothing could break it and could not be worn down by thousands of tribulations, his body was unable to block the unimaginable power contained in this palm for even an instant. The moment the palm came into contact with his body, it suddenly shook. His whole body suddenly seemed to have become a pile of countless tiny particles that were billions of times smaller than ordinary dust. In an instant, he lost all his characteristics as a whole, as if a gentle breeze would instantly turn these particles into smoke and scatter in all directions, finally disappearing without a trace. And at this moment, what appeared on Tian Mo's body was not a gentle breeze, but a powerful palm that could destroy time and space. In just an instant, these particles were directly slapped into the void, and even the process of turning into smoke and scattering in all directions was omitted, directly disappearing without a trace. It was as if they had never appeared in the first place. I didn't expect him to be able to escape in this situation. No wonder he's a supreme existence that has been passed down from the cultivation era. Luo Fan didn't feel much joy when he saw this. Instead, he sighed with emotion. With Luo Fan's strong perception ability as a connate Grand Luo Realm cultivator, the changes that happened in that instant were lengthened by hundreds of millions of times. Every subtle change that happened was like slow motion, unfolding in front of him in detail and inexplicably. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan could easily see through the truth that Tian Mo had used all his means to hide behind the scenes. At that moment, although Luo Fan seemed to have directly turned Tian Mo into dust and then slapped him into the void, causing every particle on his body to be scattered into the endless space of the entire Earth universe in an unimaginable way, unable to gather again, it was equivalent to being directly obliterated. But in reality, at that moment, Tian Mo had used some extremely special and mysterious means to condense all of his life force into a mark that was in between reality and illusion. With the power of this slap, he fled along space and time. At this moment, he had already been thrown into an unknown space and time. That space and time could be infinitely far in the past. It could also be infinitely far in the future, and it could appear in any imaginable and unimaginable space and time. Under such circumstances, even if Luo Fan had a special method to freely travel through space and time, it was still difficult to find traces of him in the infinite space and time. In other words, through this method, Tian Mo had already escaped with his life. However, after all, what he had escaped was only a mark. All of his power and will had been abandoned by him in the process. Even if he escaped, he could only be reborn through a special method and cultivate again. In the end, he might need to spend billions of years to find his power and memories. If he was lucky, he might not be able to find all of this in his entire life. In the end, he might grow into another complete living being. From this, it could be seen that the price of using this method to escape with his life was indeed quite shocking. As far as Luo Fan knew, there were probably not many innate grand heavenly realm cultivators who would choose this method to escape. Winning the phone bill after sighing, Luo Fan did not make any more moves. As mentioned before, when Luo Fan slapped that palm that contained all of his power and will, no matter what the result was, the karma between him and Tianmo was already over. At this moment, Tianmo could only be considered lucky that he could escape with his life. But he no longer needed to relentlessly pursue him. With a thought, the palm that directly slapped Tianmo into the infinite space and time shook and turned into an invisible force that instantly returned to his body, as if it had never left. Then, with a wave of his hand, his sleeve suddenly shook and turned into an overwhelming heaven and earth, moving towards the ray of purple light that was still locked in a stalemate with the magic treasure he had refined. Although the purple light itself had a considerable spirit, it was still billions of times weaker than the innate grand heavenly realm cultivators. This kind of spirit made it impossible for it to exert all of its power when facing Luo Fan after losing the control of its master. With a light guidance of Luo Fan's power, all of its power instantly hit empty air and was directly wrapped up by the heaven and earth, entering a boundless strange void where even time had stopped. After wrapping the purple light, the magic treasure in the shape of a crystal ball turned, and the countless miniature universes around it instantly collapsed and disappeared. The magic treasure in the shape of a crystal ball shook and returned to his body. After doing all this, Luo Fan raised his hands and gently separated them. His boundless state of chaos was directly torn open by him, and in the crack was the boundless void of the universe. After doing all this, he took a light step forward and his figure directly entered the crack, disappearing from the boundless state of Tianmo. As for his spiritual sense doppelganger that was hidden in the heart of this world, it had long left this world. After all, no matter how the world changed, compared to the spiritual sense doppelganger, it was only a change in the form of the power arrangement. It was a complete heaven, and the various powers had the same order as the universe on Earth. At this moment, the state was just that the various powers had become like paste, and to him, there was no difference in essence. Since there was no difference in essence, there was naturally no harm to him. It could be said that even after this world was destroyed, if he wanted to leave this place compared to when he entered this world, the difficulty was not even a little bit higher. In the universe on Earth, at the center of the nameless galaxy, at the entrance of Tianmo. 3 days after Luo Fan fearlessly stepped into the whirlpool at the entrance of that heaven, the incomparably dark whirlpool shook violently. In an instant, it completely collapsed, and turned into a strange gray mass of existence. The state of balance that was originally maintained because of the existence of this whirlpool was instantly broken. The infinite traction produced by the singularity in the center of the galaxy directly pulled this huge gray mass of existence, causing this strange mass of existence to move at a speed close to that of light, in a slight arc, and quickly fly towards the location of the singularity. The existence was originally dozens of light years away from the location of the singularity. At this moment, although this strange existence was moving towards the singularity at a speed close to that of light, it could be imagined that by the time it finally reached the location of the singularity, at least dozens of years would have passed. I didn't expect Tianmo to actually die. A leisurely sigh resounded in the void. Rainbow Shadow Supreme, I didn't expect you to actually choose this time to make a move. Then, a voice that had once sounded before resounded behind that voice. Ha ha ha. I didn't expect that I would be so easily seen through. A loud laughter resounded, and then the figure of a young man in red clothes appeared out of thin air in the void. This person was impressively the connate Grand Luo cultivator, who directly struck Tianmo down a level. At this moment, this person was laughing rather joyfully, as if he had encountered a joyous event that was enough to be remembered for eternity. In this universe, apart from you, there is no one else who can sneak into TTON without being detected, has the ability to cause fatal damage to him, and has the motive to do so. The void shook, and the shadow of an old man with an extremely high forehead, deeply sunken eyes, and 5 strands of long beard appeared out of thin air in front of the rainbow shadow supreme. I should have expected it to be you, but I didn't expect that after being struck down a level, it only took you 3 million years to recultivate, and you seem to be much stronger than before. Are you interested in a spar? Then, the void shook incessantly, and one figure after another appeared out of thin air. The person who spoke at this moment was a young man with sword-like eyebrows and eyes that seemed to flicker with sword light when he opened and closed them. Forget it, I've long since heard of your reputation, Mad Sword. I have no interest in going crazy with you. The Rainbow Shadow Supreme looked towards the voice, and couldn't help but wave his hand repeatedly. This seems to be quite useful. There couldn't be a better time for the two of you to spar. It would also be a good opportunity for us to broaden our horizons and look up to you, ha. A bald middle-aged man chuckled. The dozen or so people who had just appeared in the surroundings either had expressions of agreement or disdain, but most of them had expressions of calmness and indifference, as if they didn't care about these things at all. There were exactly 36 of these figures that had appeared, and there were no more and no less. Each of these figures had a different ball of air hanging behind their heads, but all of them emitted an aura of perfection, an aura that could not be damaged or broken by anything. These balls of air were of different sizes, with the largest being several tens of thousands of feet in diameter, and the smallest being a few feet in diameter. But no matter how big or small they were, these balls of air were extremely profound, as if they had some sort of inconceivable fusion with the Great Tao, but also seemed to be completely isolated from the Great Tao, forming a whole of their own. Moreover, the size of the balls of air did not represent the strength of these balls of air. The aura that the balls of air with a diameter of several tens of thousands of feet in diameter emitted was not necessarily much stronger than the balls of air with a diameter of a few feet, and the balls of air with a diameter of a few feet were not just one of these 36 balls of air. The difference in the size of these balls of air seemed to only indicate the profundity of the grand heavenly Tao that these figures had comprehended. At this point, the matter was already very clear. These figures were naturally innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators, and most of them were the ones who had spoken to Luo Fan when he had easily entered the Titian skyscraper 3 days ago. At this moment, these people stood there simultaneously, chatting casually as if they were waiting for something. After a while, a strange crack appeared in the void. This crack led to an unknown distant space, and what came out of the crack was a boundless gray swamp. Then, a figure stepped out of the crack in an extremely relaxed, natural, and calm manner, and directly appeared in the void. Looking at the place where he appeared, it just happened to be a gap in the arrangement of the 3 innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators. The position of this gap was extremely profound, and it just happened to form a strange 3-dimensional ring with the positions of the innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators, forming an extremely profound pattern. This figure was obviously Luo Fan. After Luo Fan appeared, although he was slightly surprised by the existence of the innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators around him, the expression on his face did not change at all. He only bowed slightly and said, "My name is Luo Fan, greetings, fellow Taoists. My name is Exalted Rainbow Shadow, greetings, fellow Taoist." The red-clothed youth bowed solemnly. "My name is Jian Feng, greetings, fellow Taoist." The youth called Jian Feng also greeted. "My name is Ping Dong, greetings, fellow Taoist." Like parents, the 3 innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators successively greeted Luo Fan in a rather solemn and serious manner. Obviously, the 3 innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators used the same method to express their goodwill to Luo Fan. Every single one of the 3 innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators had unimaginable achievements in a certain type of cultivation, and the 36 of them practically represented the 36 sides of the Great Tao. Although each of them only spoke a single sentence to Luo Fan and introduced themselves, when the 36 of them finished their introductions, Luo Fan suddenly understood many indescribable things about the three innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators. It was as if he had been with these innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators for countless years. This was how the innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators interacted with each other. As long as he was willing, there was no need for words, no need for thoughts, no need for spiritual sense, no need for anything else. With just a simple sentence, he could easily let each other understand many facts that could not be described with words. Through this method, Luo Fan instantly grasped the method of this method. He smiled and said, "Today, I and Tianma have formed karma, but alarmed fellow Taoists, I am truly ashamed." As soon as these words left his mouth, the three innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators vaguely understood many indescribable things about Luo Fan's character and cultivation characteristics. This caused the three innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators to exchange glances, and most of their eyes were filled with admiration. Obviously, they were very surprised that Luo Fan could so easily and so quickly grasp the crux of the innate grand heavenly Tao cultivation method. "You're so annoying. You're clearly asking us why we're standing guard here, yet you insist on beating around the bush. Annoying, annoying." Exalted Rainbow Shadow frowned and shouted, "Ha ha!" Luo Fan could not help but smile when he heard that, but he did not refute it. At his level, there was no need to be entangled in some words. Moreover, words were no longer an obstacle to the method. No matter what words he said, or what words he used to cover it up, as long as he had the intention in his heart when he spoke, he would definitely not be able to hide it from the other innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators. Therefore, even if he had asked some other nonsense, what he was thinking at that time would definitely be known by all the innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators present. Under such circumstances, why would he need to refute or entangle himself in the words that he said? "I have a place in the South Heaven River system. If fellow Taoist is interested, you can come and have some fun. Pingdong welcomes you, and I shall take my leave today." At this moment, the person who called himself Pingdong smiled, and said to Luo Fan, "At this level, empty words and lies were of no use, since the instant they were spoken, people of the same level would be able to hear the true meaning of the words." It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan knew that this invitation was sincere as soon as he spoke, so he naturally did not dare to be disrespectful and said, "Thank you for your invitation, fellow Taoist. I'll definitely head over when I'm free in the future." That person smiled and nodded to Luo Fan, and then his figure shook before he gradually turned ethereal in an extremely strange manner. After an instant, he vanished without a trace. In an instant, he'd utilized some sort of profundity that Luo Fan did not truly know of to travel through space and directly left. Along with that person speaking, over 30 innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators successively invited Luo Fan to visit their respective places when he was free in the future. Since Luo Fan had already agreed, he naturally would not refuse the other innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators, and he agreed one by one. As for whether he would go in the future or not, it was naturally impossible to say. But agreeing represented that he'd accepted the goodwill of everyone, and it represented that he'd established a certain level of relationship with all of them. So, he would have a foundation to take a step further in the future. After those innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators invited Luo Fan to visit their places in the future and obtained Luo Fan's agreement, they left right after Pingdong. Moreover, the methods they used to leave were all different. Some used the simplest method of tearing open the void to leave, while others used some method of fusing with laws and rules to leave. Some directly broke through the light and flew away in a method that was countless times faster than light. All of these methods were different, and they revealed their respective daos of cultivation. In the end, only the two innate grand heavenly Tao cultivators, Rainbow Shadow and Mad Sword, remained on the spot. Meanwhile, Rainbow Shadow seemed to be slightly helpless as he said to Luo Fan, "Fellow Taoist Luo, could it be that you still intend to conceal it now? Where's the other fellow Taoist? Why hasn't he made an appearance yet?" That's right. Registered users receive Q coins every single day. Chapter 645. So there's another fellow Taoist here. This fellow Taoist's concealment ability is really beyond imagination. You actually didn't notice that there were so many fellow Taoists here. Look, Sword Lunatic said with a smile. When Luo Fan heard their words, he was not surprised at all, whether it was in his heart or on the surface. It was not surprising that Rainbow Shadow Lord was able to notice that another existence had participated in the attack against Tianmo. After all, Rainbow Shadow Lord was also involved in this matter. Even if he originally had no connection with Luo Fan's spiritual sense doppelganger, and could not even sense the existence of Luo Fan's spiritual sense doppelganger, as long as he was involved in the same matter, there was naturally a cause and effect. This cause and effect was no different from not existing for ordinary people or even ordinary cultivators, but for existences at the level of Khanate Grand Luo realm. This cause and effect was enough for Rainbow Shadow Lord to sense the existence of the spiritual sense doppelganger. Even during this process, Rainbow Shadow Lord still could not sense where the spiritual sense doppelganger was, and what method it used to evade his detection. In this way, how could Rainbow Shadow Lord not know that there was another existence involved in the attack against Tianmo? Because of this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "There's no one else, just a doppelganger of mine." As he spoke, his spiritual sense doppelganger shook slightly, and suddenly appeared in the void through some extremely obscure method, appearing between the three of them. It faced Rainbow Shadow Lord and Sword Lunatic from afar. At the moment when this spiritual sense doppelganger appeared, an indescribable aura instantly spread out from it, and instantly spread out tens of thousands of light years. Under this aura, all the forces, all the matter, and even time and space within the range of tens of thousands of light years began to produce some very strange changes. It was as if these forces, matter, time, and space suddenly had a bias, and began to breathe along with the spiritual sense doppelganger's breathing, and changed according to his movements and thoughts. This sort of change wasn't obvious, and it was even to the extent that an ordinary golden immortal realm cultivator would notice it if they didn't pay full attention to it. However, to Rainbow Shadow and Lunatic Sword, this sort of change was so obvious that it caused their expressions to change drastically. This was not only because of the nature of the transformation and the range of the transformation, but also because no matter how hard the two of them tried, no matter how much they improved their perception, they could not sense how the figure appeared, and what kind of unfathomable mystery it was displaying in the process. It was as if the existence of this person had far exceeded the limits of their understanding. Because of this feeling, both Senior Rainbow Shadow and Lunatic Sword's expressions changed greatly. Although the Rainbow Shadow Exalt and the Lunatic Swordsman looked young, the truth was that both of them had lived in the universe for hundreds of millions of years to become Khanate Grand Luo. Such a long period of time was naturally nothing to a universe, but it was absolutely not a short period of time to any living being. Such a period of time was sufficient for the two of them to possess practically omniscient knowledge. However, it was precisely this sort of experience that had been accumulated for hundreds of millions of years, and it could practically be said to be omniscient knowledge. Yet they were actually unable to understand exactly how the existence before them existed, and they were unable to understand why the appearance of this existence would cause such an unbelievable change to occur in an area of a few tens of thousands of light years. How could they not be astounded by this? How could their expressions remain unchanged? On the other hand, both of them noticed from each other's eyes that they were actually unable to understand the existence before them just like they were, and the shock they felt instantly rose by a few degrees. If only they didn't understand it, then it could be said that they'd overlooked something. But if both of them didn't understand it at the same time, then it was absolutely not something that could be described as an oversight. It could only mean that the existence before them contained profundities that had practically surpassed the limits of most connate grand luo. How could they not feel even more astounded by this? Fortunately, connate grand luo cultivators couldn't be compared to ordinary people after all. After an instant, their expressions returned to normal, and the rainbow shadow exalt even sighed. I never expected that even though we'd overestimated you since a long time ago, we'd actually still underestimated you in the end. I've won the money. Exactly. That's perfect. I haven't properly sparred with someone for millions of years. Fellow Taoist, please don't be courteous with me. The sword lunatic's eyes lit up, and the sword light in his eyes seemed to grow even more dazzling as he spoke. As he spoke, the ball of Grand Luo that faintly flickered with sword light behind his head started to throb madly. It seemed like it was on high alert and was preparing to launch all sorts of unbelievable attacks at any moment. When Luo Fan saw this, he hurriedly waved his hand and said, "That won't do. I've exhausted too much energy today, and my condition is terrible. How can I spar with fellow Taoist? I'll come again in the future. Of course, this was nonsense. Connate Grand Luo cultivators had a body of their own, and the energy within their bodies was constantly being born from nothingness. No matter how much energy was exhausted, it could be replenished in an extremely short period of time. How could there be such a thing as exhausting too much energy and being in terrible condition? The reason he said this was naturally because Luo Fan wasn't willing to spar with the sword lunatic right now. After all, he wasn't a battle maniac. For the sake of comprehending the profundities of the Grand Luo realm before attaining the connate Grand Luo realm, he naturally looked forward to spar with a connate Grand Luo realm cultivator. However, after attaining the connate Grand Luo realm, the desire to spar with a connate Grand Luo realm cultivator had decreased rapidly, and after he formed the karma with Tianma this time, this desire to spar with a connate Grand Luo realm cultivator was practically non-existent. After all, the strength of a connate Grand Luo realm cultivator was formidable to an unimaginable extent, and the destructive force that erupted from any single move of theirs was even capable of obliterating the universe. Under such circumstances, even if Luo Fan had absolute confidence in himself, he didn't dare to guarantee that he wouldn't fall into unpredictable danger because of the sword lunatic's sudden and irrational choice. Under such circumstances, if he had no choice but to end the karma entanglement, then he naturally wouldn't have any thoughts of retreating. However, this sort of spar that wasn't nutritious and was purely for the sake of enjoying the joy of battle was naturally not something he was willing to do. Are you going crazy again, sword lunatic? Every time you spar with someone, you end up forgetting everything. You've destroyed galaxies and destroyed Dong Tian. Haven't you done enough? If you hadn't destroyed my Dong Tian when you were exchanging pointers with others, would I have fallen to Tian Mo's level? Rainbow Shadow Lord cursed angrily. The sword lunatic frowned and said, "Is there a need to remember such a trivial matter for so long? It's been millions of years. Besides, if I hadn't destroyed your Dong Tian, would you have been able to cultivate that universe heavenly punishment? Was he able to defeat Tian Mo so easily this time to exact his revenge? Let's take another step back. Back then, I had an agreement with Jiang Di to fight. Who knew that your Dong Tian was hidden there? It was just your luck that it was destroyed. You shameless lunatic universe sky execution, I already know how to refine it. If you didn't break my sky dong, I wouldn't need to use the broken pieces of my sky dong to practice this move." Rainbow Shadow Lord's face was flushed with anger, which matched his red esi robe very well. "Haha, no need to be so polite, no need to be so polite. You and I have been fighting each other for a long time. It's only right that we help each other." The sword lunatic lord laughed and said with sharp sword light in his eyes. Judging from his words, It was as if breaking the Rainbow Shadow Venerable's Dong Tian was a great deed. That kind of infuriating look made people want to rush forward and beat him up. Rainbow Shadow Lord's eyes shone with a gaze that could pierce through any living creature. His aura fluctuated unceasingly, as if he was about to use all his strength to fight with the Sword Lunatic Lord. But soon, he reacted. All the expressions of anger disappeared, and his face became calm again. His aura also calmed down. Humph, you want to provoke me to fight with you? How can I obey you? If you want to fight with me, you have to accompany me for a Dong Tian. As long as you accompany me for a Dong Tian, I will go to your Dong Tian and fight with you. Rainbow Shadow Lord said with disdain. When the Sword Lunatic Lord heard Rainbow Shadow Lord, he couldn't help but feel disheartened. The infuriating look on his face disappeared without a trace. His expression and movements returned to their previous calmness. He said, "It's a pity that you reacted at the last moment. What a pity, what a pity." During this process, Luo Fan had been watching the two of them chatting. After a round of chatting, he had the most intuitive understanding of the two of them. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Rainbow Shadow Lord and Sword Lunatic Lord had cultivated for such a long time, but they were still able to maintain this kind of mentality. It was really commendable, which made him admire them. Fellow Taoist Luo, what Tao does your avatar cultivate? Why haven't I seen such a cultivation method before? Of course, if it's a secret, you don't have to say it. I'm just curious. Rainbow Shadow Lord couldn't be bothered with the Sword Lunatic Lord and said to Luo Fan. Luo Fan smiled as if the argument between Rainbow Shadow Lord and Sword Lunatic Lord didn't happen in front of him. He said, "It's not a secret. My avatar cultivates the Tao of Power. It's something I obtained unintentionally. Unfortunately, it's not perfect and systematic. I can't find a way to replicate it. Otherwise, I would have told you two to give me pointers. The Tao of Power, so that's how it is." Rainbow Shadow Lord and Sword Lunatic Lord came to a sudden realization. Their gazes towards Luo Fan became filled with admiration. They had naturally heard of the Tao of Power. They had even frequently used it in their own cultivation. However, to them, the Tao of Power was just a method of application. Their understanding of the Tao of Power was limited to how to perfectly increase their strength and use it. At most, it could only rise to the level of extremely fine control of every strand of strength in one's body. However, Luo Fan had directly raised the Tao of Power to the level of a Grand Tao. He had even cultivated to the same level as a connate grand heavenly realm by relying on this method, allowing his existence to reach a state that surpassed the limits of almost all connate grand heavenly realms in the universe. This unbelievable thing was enough to show how outstanding the person before them was, so how could they not admire him? "I'm ashamed." Luo Fan smiled and said. As he spoke, his spiritual sense avatar gently swayed and disappeared in the same way as before, surpassing the limits of understanding of the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign and Sword Lunatic Master. He had once again hidden himself in the mysterious world of power. Rainbow Shadow Lord and Sword Lunatic Lord seemed to have some understanding about the avatar disappearing in this way. However, it was clear that the difference in their cultivation made it impossible for them to understand the true profundity of it. At most, their experiences only gave them a deeper and more intuitive understanding of the Tao of Power. "This isn't a good place to talk. Why don't the two of you come to my Dong Tian and have a place to talk?" Sword Lunatic Lord said with a smile. As soon as he said this, the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign laughed and said, "Good. I heard that your Dong Tian is a sword realm. I want to see it." Even though his words were filled with praise, his eyes revealed all sorts of dangerous auras. It was as if he was thinking about how to do something in the sword realm that would allow him to vent the displeasure in his heart. Seeing Rainbow Shadow Lord's gaze, Sword Lunatic Lord raised his brows and revealed a faint smile. He had obviously seen through Rainbow Shadow Lord's plan, but he was happy to see it happen. Luo Fan could not help but shake his head and laugh when he saw the changes in the two people's spirits. One of them planned to go to the other's Dong Tian and make a scene, to take revenge for the fact that his Dong Tian had been destroyed because of the other. On the other hand, Sword Lunatic Lord wanted to destroy his own Dong Tian so that he could find an excuse to fight with Sword Lunatic Lord. After laughing, he said, "Then I'll have to trouble you, fellow Taoist." The Dong Tian was the base of a Khanate Grand Heavenly Realm cultivator. It was also the place where a Khanate Grand Heavenly Realm cultivator could exert his strength and power. Stepping into the Dong Tian of a Khanate Grand Heavenly Realm cultivator was equivalent to stepping into a place that had a great advantage over the Khanate Grand Heavenly Realm cultivator. It could be said that this was not much different from giving someone a handle. Normally speaking, unless one had absolute trust in another or absolute confidence in oneself, one would absolutely not step into the Dong Tian of another Khanate Grand Heavenly Realm cultivator. At this moment, besides the fact that he was rather interested in the Sword Realm, Luo Fan had agreed to head to Sword Lunatic Lord's Dong Tian so readily because he was absolutely confident in himself. He was confident that no matter how profound Sword Lunatic Lord's Dong Tian was, even if he was unable to defeat Sword Lunatic Lord within the Dong Tian, it would absolutely not be a problem for him to flee. When Sword Lunatic Lord heard that both Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow had agreed to his invitation, he roared with laughter and said, "All right. It has been a few 100 million years since a fellow Taoist was willing to approach my Sword Realm. I never expected that two fellow Taoists would actually be willing to come today. I'm extremely delighted, extremely delighted. This way, please." As soon as he finished speaking, Sword Lunatic Lord waved his hand casually, and then countless rays of light shot out from the Grand Heavenly Realm behind him. In an instant they formed an enormous door in the sky. This door was 30 m tall. Every single line, every single turn, every single stripe, and even every single speck of dust that formed this door was completely formed from the accumulation of extremely profound rays of light. These rays of light were extremely profound. Every single one of them seemed as if they had existed since time immemorial, as if they were created along with the creation of the universe. They emanated a boundless and primordial aura, and every single ray of light carried a profound aura that seemed indestructible. These rays of light faintly connected to an unknown expanse of space that was extremely far away, and it seemed as if one would be able to leave this expanse of space upon passing through this door. After the door was formed, it shook slightly, and then the two enormous doors opened inwards to gradually reveal the world behind the door. It was a passageway that led to an unknown expanse of space. This passageway was surrounded by an infinitely deep void. In the void, there were countless strange rays of light that had an unknown source and an unknown end. They were arranged in an extremely special way. This arrangement caused these rays of light that had no head or tail, or rather, were so long that they did not cover the entire passageway. Instead, they were very strangely scattered, as if they were long stars that had no head or tail. This ray of light had no head or tail like the next ray of light, and they both seemed to be infinitely long, but in the eyes of an ordinary person, they were basically on the same straight line. The structure was so profound that it could hardly be described with words, and at the end of the seemingly infinitely long passageway, there seemed to be a strange and grand world. A boundless and primordial aura faintly emanated from that world, and it rolled over in waves. Standing in front of the door, Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Sovereign could clearly feel it. The two madmen laughed. As they spoke, they stepped into the door and stood at the entrance of the passageway, waiting for Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Sovereign. Luo Fan faintly smiled and followed Lunatic Sword into the door. The Rainbow Shadow Venerable was not the slightest bit slow. He moved his feet and arrived at the entrance of the passage almost at the same time as Luo Fan. The moment the three of them stepped into the passageway, the void shook, and the door formed by countless rays of sword light slowly closed. Then, with a bang, the door collapsed into countless rays of sword light. The rays of sword light merged into the void and disappeared without a trace. The void had also regained its calm. Apart from the strange Titian Mo Dong heavenly entrance that had already turned into a grey giant that was rushing towards the singularity in the middle of the river system, there was no difference between this place and the one before Luo Fan had arrived at this place. At this moment, Luo Fan and the other two were in an extremely mysterious state. Faintly, Luo Fan even sensed a feeling that was somewhat similar to when he used his special ability to travel through spacetime. This is actually a spacetime passageway. It seems that Sword Madman's sun isn't tightly attached to Earth's universe like Tian Mo's sun. Such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. Chapter 646. The spacetime passageway shuttled between time and space. One had to pass through the spacetime passageway to reach the world of swords. This meant that the world of swords was not in the same spacetime as the Earth of Swords. As for exactly where it was and when it was, even Luo Fan couldn't directly see through this spatial passageway. He had to truly arrive at the sword world and truly sense that expanse of spacetime before he could truly be sure. Please be familiar with the domain name. Please keep in mind. With various thoughts in his mind, Luo Fan, the Rainbow Shadow Honored One, and the Sword Maniac continued to move forward in the spacetime passageway. They gradually got closer to the end of the spacetime passageway and the Dong Tian that was in a different spacetime from the Earth of Swords. As they got closer to the Dong Tian, an inexplicable feeling gradually welled up in Luo Fan's heart. It was as if he was walking toward a sword that contained the Great Tao and even replaced the Great Tao to control the universe. He could faintly feel an inexplicable chill even though he was protected by a zenith heaven immortal. After an unknown period of time, the spacetime passageway shook slightly. The three of them appeared in a boundless and vast world. This world was incomparably huge with a round sky and a square earth. It was not much different from the Titian Mo Dong Tian that Luo Fan had seen before, the heavenly realm above the core of the Earth's sun, or even many other worlds other than the Earth of Swords. Below this world, there were all sorts of natural sceneries in the boundless land. There were white clouds in the sky, and the sun hung high in the sky. One could even vaguely see the boundless starry sky behind the sun. It was the same boundless starry sky as the Earth of Swords. So that's how it is. It's really mysterious and unbelievable. Luo Fan arrived at the Dong Tian and sensed it slightly. He could not help but exclaim in admiration. This world seemed to be alive. Everything seemed to be no different from the Dong Tian and the world he had seen in the past. It seemed to be very ordinary. However, as long as he sensed it carefully, he would instantly know how mysterious and unbelievable this Dong Tian was. In this Dong Tian, everything was a sword. The gas that suffused the heavens and the earth was a myriad of strands of sword chi. Among the sword chi were lightning sword chi, creation sword chi, destruction sword chi, entrapment sword chi, and the most common metal, wood, water, fire, earth sword chi, yin sword chi, and yang sword chi. It could be said that any breath taken by any living creature in this Dong Tian contained almost all kinds of sword chi in this universe. If his talent was higher, he would be able to analyze the energy in detail and comprehend the mysteries of the sword Tao. It wouldn't be difficult. Besides the boundless gas that suffused the heavens and the earth, the sun that hung high in the sky was actually a ball of extremely condensed sword light that had been raised to an unbelievable level. The boundless light that spilled over the entire world was the boundless sword light. The ground below was constructed from countless tiny sword rays, sword bodies, sword threads, sword chis, and sword light in all sorts of inconceivable ways. Although they were vivid and lifelike, the essence of each substance was still a sword. The essence of each substance contained a certain mystery of the sword Tao. It's a pity that the essence of living creatures is still somewhat illusory. Otherwise, I'm afraid you would have become a sage long ago. Luo Fan observed for a while and sighed again. This sigh seemed to be filled with regret, and there wasn't even the slightest trace of taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune. It was even to the extent that there wasn't even the slightest thought of heaving a sigh of relief. It seemed so calm that it caused Jian Feng's expression to involuntarily ease up greatly. This Dong Tian is the condensation of my life's sword Tao. It exists between illusory and real, beyond time and space. However, my sword Tao isn't perfect, so I can't turn it into reality. It's still a long time before I can become a sage. The crazy sword cultivator sighed and said, This Dong Tian is the condensation of my life's sword Tao. This Dong Tian seems so mysterious and unbelievable. Not only was it constructed by the sword through all sorts of mysterious methods, but it also gave birth to countless living creatures. In fact, there were even countless living beings with complete intelligence, cultivating, reproducing, and doing all the things that normal living beings could do. This profundity was enough to make any cultivator who stepped into it unconsciously feel that the sword Tao was the grand Tao of heaven and earth. It was the essence of the grand Tao, causing them to unknowingly give up their own Tao and devote themselves to the sword Tao. However, as the world operated and the countless living creatures moved about in the Dong Tian, Luo Fan could faintly feel that everything was slightly illusory. It was as if everything existed between illusory and real. It had been condensed from nothingness, but it wasn't completely formed. It was this flaw that allowed Luo Fan to instantly understand the essence of the world. He knew where the imperfections of the sword world were. Good fellow, you actually created a world out of nothingness outside of time and space. No wonder you're the only one who has provoked others over the past hundreds of millions of years, and no one has been able to find your existence. No wonder you're so unscrupulous. You're too cunning, too wretched. Rainbow Shadow Lord seemed to have just recovered from his shock and shouted, You're insulting me. Come, come, come. Let's fight 300 rounds before we talk about right or wrong. The crazy sword cultivator's eyes lit up and he shouted. The origin Luo behind his head trembled and countless rays of sword light appeared, making the origin Luo look like a hedgehog made of sword light. The Rainbow Shadow Sovereign waved his hand and said, Enough. I'm not interested in fighting you right now. You condensed this Dong Tian from nothingness. Even if I destroy it 100 times, it'll only give you 100 chances to destroy it and then rebuild it. It'll only bring you benefits. I won't do something like that. The Rainbow Shadow Sovereign waved his hand and said, That's not up to you. I'll definitely fight you today. The crazy sword cultivator shouted and the origin Luo behind his head trembled again. The hundreds of millions of rays of sword light instantly shot out and gathered in the void. They turned into a sword river that wrapped around countless strange sword spirits and pounced towards the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign. The Rainbow Shadow Sovereign just waved his hand and shook his head. He didn't use any strength to resist, as if he didn't see the sword river that could destroy space and time rushing towards him with an extremely dangerous momentum. The sword river's momentum was extremely shocking. It even caused the space and time of the sword world to distort violently, causing countless strange lights and shadows to appear around the sword river. These lights and shadows were extremely mysterious. It seemed like countless people were using all kinds of strange methods to practice various sword techniques and comprehend various sword principles. These were the countless sword lights in the sword river that were connected to the great Tao. They naturally borrowed the power of the distortion of spacetime to display the light and shadow that all the cultivators of the way of the sword in the sword river had comprehended in the endless planets in the Earth's universe. These light and shadows didn't have any power, but they showed how mysterious the sword river was. The river of swords swept past Rainbow Shadow Sr. without any resistance. From the outside, it looked like the river of swords had swept Rainbow Shadow Sr. into the river. But during this process, the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign still didn't move. He didn't even let the power in his body react, as if the sword river was just an illusory light and shadow. After a long time, Jian Feng cursed unwillingly. The Grand Luo behind his head shuddered, and the river of swords instantly crumbled, turning into boundless sword light like 100 million birds returning to their nests. All of them returned to the Grand Luo and disappeared without a trace. The Grand Luo also returned to its original calm state, as if nothing had happened. The Rainbow Shadow Sovereign was still quietly floating there. His expression was the same as before, and even his clothes weren't damaged by the Sword River. It was as if the Sword River was really just an illusion. "You win." The crazy sword cursed helplessly. He turned around and said to Luo Fan, "My residence is at the center of the earth. Fellow Taoist, please follow me." With that, he and Luo Fan took the lead and flew towards the towering sword mountain in the center of the earth. The Rainbow Shadow Sovereign arrived at this moment. He chuckled and said, "You want to beat me up? No way." After saying that, he followed behind Luo Fan and Jian Feng towards the center of the sword mountain. His speed wasn't any slower than the two of them. What happened to Fang Yun was very simple. The crazy sword cultivator wanted to beat the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign with his powerful attack in order to satisfy his desire to fight others. However, the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign didn't care. No matter how shocking and terrifying the Sword River was, he didn't use any of his power and didn't make any movements to resist. He let the Sword River easily sweep him up, as if it could easily kill him. Although the crazy sword cultivator was called Crazy, his real name was Jian Feng, not Crazy Sword Cultivator. All he wanted was to fight the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign and enjoy the fun of fighting. He didn't want the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign's life. Moreover, the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign didn't resist at all, so the Sword River couldn't kill him. As long as he couldn't kill him in one move, then if the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign continued to attack him, there would be endless karma between him and the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign in the future. Their relationship, which could have been genuine Taoist friends, would instantly become irreconcilable enemies. In this situation, if the crazy sword cultivator wasn't truly crazy, why would he make such a choice? Therefore, the moment the River of Swords swallowed the Rainbow Shadow God, even though Jian Feng showed his crazed side, as if he really wanted to kill the Rainbow Shadow God, he still controlled the River of Swords at the last moment to go around the Rainbow Shadow God. Although the Rainbow Shadow God was swallowed by the River of Swords, he wasn't injured at all. It wasn't hard to imagine how depressed the crazy sword cultivator was when his opponent didn't resist at all and forced him to give up fighting. The Dong Tian was extremely vast. If an ordinary person wanted to go from where the three of them were to the Sword Mountain in the middle of the land, even if they rode fast horses, it would take at least tens of millions of years if they could live that long. However, to the three of them who were at the Khanate Golden Immortal Realm, how could such a long distance be considered a distance when compared to the distance between the two closest stellar systems in Earth's universe that could only be calculated in light years? In just a few breaths, they arrived at the top of the Sword Mountain in a leisurely and slow manner. In other words, they arrived at the tip of the Sword Mountain that was shaped like a long sword. This place was the center of the Dong Tian and also the highest place. It was also the hub of the Dong Tian. The infinite sword aura, sword rays, sword will, sword rays, sword bodies, everything in the Dong Tian had a very subtle and mysterious connection with this place. As soon as Luo Fan set foot on the tip of the sword, he felt a soaring sword aura pressing down on him. This aura was so powerful that it even made Luo Fan feel like he was facing the Great Way. Although he didn't sigh that he was extremely small like a speck of dust, he still felt quite shocked. So this is the sword. After the shock, this thought suddenly appeared in Luo Fan's mind. This sword aura was so pure that it was unimaginable. There wasn't a single trace of anything else in it. What yin, yang, 5 elements, thunder, life, destruction, slaughter. Everything else was in common sense. Sword chi, sword intent and sword Tao couldn't be found in it. All the appearance of the sword aura, sword intent, and sword principle had been stripped away. This sword aura in front of him was the essence of all the sword aura, sword intent, and sword principle. It was also the essence of the sword in this universe, this infinite space, and this sword origin. It could be said that this sword aura had already described the way of the sword to the limit. Anyone who sensed this aura would instantly feel that everything they'd seen, comprehended, and sensed in the past that was related to the sword had taken an extremely long detour, and they were extremely far away from the true essence of the sword. After such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind, Luo Fan suddenly, all the wonderful techniques, divine powers, spells, formations, and even cultivation methods that he had comprehended in the past seemed to be able to be transformed into sword technique. They seemed to be able to be described with the sword and achieved with the sword. After a long time, Luo Fan let out a long breath. The light in his eyes was still as calm and indifferent as before. He smiled and said, "To be able to improve the way of the sword to such a level, Luo Fan really admires your ability. No wonder there are so many living beings gathered around the Sword Mountain. So it turns out that just sensing this aura allows one to directly comprehend the boundless sword Tao. One doesn't even need to cultivate bitterly to cultivate a supreme divine ability." At this moment, the Rainbow Shadow Exalt spoke. His words seemed to be filled with regret and emotion. If it was an ordinary person, or even a cultivator with a golden core, the moment they sensed this aura, they would be directly affected by this aura. Their view of the world and their understanding of the way of the sword would be reversed, and they would treat the way of the sword contained in this aura as the true way of the sword. From then on, they would be immersed in the pursuit of the way of the sword. As long as there was such a change, these living beings and cultivators would definitely worship and revere Jian Fanatic, who created this sword aura. They would treat him as the supreme Tao sovereign, and no matter how they spoke to him before, they would definitely be respectful and would not let down their guard in the slightest. And from the performance of Luo Fan and Senior Rainbow Shadow at this moment, it could be seen that this kind of aura, which was enough to distort the worldview of ordinary creatures and even cultivators who had cultivated to the innate leakless golden core, could not really affect them at all. They were still the same as they were in the past. This was only natural. Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Lord were both golden immortal realm cultivators, and their Daos had attained perfection. Moreover, they'd even condensed a material golden immortal realm that appeared behind their head. They'd long since attained the state of being able to describe the entire universe with their Dao. The firmness of their Taoist hearts was obvious. Even though this aura was so profound, it was only a Tao of another to them. At most, it could only verify the Tao they cultivated, so how could it change their view of the world? Jian Fanatic wasn't surprised by their behavior, and he just smiled lightly and said, "Even though this aura has practically exhausted the essence of the way of the sword, it's still incomplete. That's why it's acting like this. If it was truly complete, then it would be untraceable like the way of the way, and there wouldn't be such side effect." As soon as he finished speaking, both Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Lord nodded. Obviously, they agreed with Jian Fanatic. The Grand Tao was like an abyss that filled the universe. All living beings and all existences were affected and controlled by it. However, besides cultivators that were able to faintly sense its vastness, it didn't exist to ordinary living beings at all. It was even to the extent that ordinary cultivators had only heard of the Grand Tao's name and hadn't seen its form. If this aura of the sword had truly exhausted the essence of the way of the sword, then it would definitely possess the characteristics of a Grand Tao, and it would definitely not have the side effects of changing one's heart. Exactly. To Jian Fanatic and the others, this aura that was inconceivably extraordinary in the eyes of ordinary people was only a side effect. The Tao cultivated by any golden immortal realm cultivator would definitely be different from others. Even if they cultivated the same cultivation technique or even had the same fortuitous encounters, the Tao they cultivated would definitely be different. This wasn't decided by the laws of the Grand Tao, nor was it restricted by any laws. It was because the hearts of any two living beings would definitely be different, and the Tao of cultivation that was formed from it would naturally be different as well. So, it could be said that any golden immortal realm cultivator had nothing to do with good or evil, and they placed great emphasis on the existence of their own will. Because without an extraordinarily strong will and a firm heart, it would be utterly impossible for one to persist on the long path of cultivation, and it would naturally be impossible for one to attain the golden immortal realm. With such a characteristic, any technique capable of changing the heart and changing the heart of a cultivator could naturally only be considered as an inferior technique to any golden immortal realm cultivator. Based on this, any aura that changed the heart and persisted on the Tao was naturally only a side effect. It could be utilized against enemies, but it was a poison if utilized to foster cultivators. Swoosh. Chapter 647. The top of the Sword Mountain is not like an ordinary mountain. It looks sharp from afar, but it looks flat when you get close. In fact, the top of the Sword Mountain looks the same no matter how close or far it is. It's the same sword tip. At the top of the Sword Mountain, a few thousand feet away from the sword tip, there is an island that seems to be made up of billions of swords floating in the air. Above it is the place where the sword aura is the densest, and it's also where Sword Lunatic live. Luo Fan and Sword Lunatic Rainbow Shadow are at the edge of the island at this moment. Sword Lunatic invited the two to step on the island with a smile, and led the way to the center of the island. The entire island looks only a few hundred feet from the outside, but it's extremely wide inside, at least 10,000 miles in circumference. There are mountains, swamps, plains and hills on it, almost like a miniature sword realm. Obviously, the sword aura emitted from here is so dense. All kinds of strange existences that contain almost all the terrains of the universe are naturally made up of all kinds of sword aura, sword intent, sword spirit, sword light, sword body and other sword-related existences through various incredible methods. And in the center of the island, there is an area of a few hundred miles that has nothing to do with swords. This area is a void. Only a thatched cottage in the center seems to have been created out of thin air, as if it was born before the universe was created. This thatched cottage is extremely ordinary. There is not a trace of sword-related aura on it, but it seems to be made of the most common thatch and wood in the universe on Earth. So fellow Taoist has reached such a level, I really admire you. Luo Fan saw the thatched cottage, and could not help but praise. Rainbow Shadow Sovereign also had a look of admiration on his face. Both of them are innate Zenith Heaven cultivators, and their cultivation realm is high, reaching the highest level in the entire universe on Earth. Naturally, there is no need to mention the strength of their perception. However, when they saw the straw hut, they could easily tell that the straw hut was not really built from ordinary thatch and wood from Earth's universe. Instead, it was a form of deducing the way of the sword to the extreme, ultimately returning to its original state, displaying this seemingly ordinary scene. The more natural and ordinary the thatched hut looked, the more profound the comprehension of the sword lunatic swordsman was, and the more profound his cultivation realm was. This level of attainment was something that even the current Luo Fan was absolutely unable to achieve, so how could he not praise it? Although Senior Rainbow Shadow seemed to be at loggerheads with Lunatic Sword, it was just a facade. In fact, if he was really at loggerheads with Lunatic Sword, how could he have come to the Dong Tian that Lunatic Sword had created? Therefore, when he saw the wonders of this thatched hut, he was not stingy with his praise and did not suppress his emotions. Seeing their expressions, Jianfengzi wasn't the slightest bit complacent. Instead, he sighed and said, "Although I've sensed the pinnacle of the sword, that's all there is to it. My comprehension of the sword has reached a bottleneck, and I haven't made any progress for billions of years. My cultivation has also stagnated, and I can't find any way to break through. After listening to Lunatic Sword's words, Luo Fan carefully looked at the boundary between the void and the outside island, and found that the power of the outside world was unimaginably strong. It was actually the outside world that was constantly pressuring the void, trying to corrode it, trying to transform the void into a world that was completely made of all kinds of existences related to the sword. What kind of situation did this mean? Not only did Luo Fan understand with a glance, even Senior Rainbow Shadow instantly understood Lunatic Sword's current embarrassing situation. This was clearly Lunatic Sword's comprehension of the pinnacle of the sword was slowly deteriorating, and was about to decline towards the realm that he had comprehended in the past, which was a level lower than the realm represented by the thatched hut in the center. From this, Luo Fan finally understood why the sword Lunatic had such a strong desire to fight. It was clearly because he wanted to find the inspiration he had obtained in the past in battle, and at the same time, he wanted to stabilize his cultivation and begin to improve to the next level. As they spoke, the three of them landed in front of the thatched hut. When they stepped on the ground, everything felt like the most ordinary land in the universe. Whether it was the smell or the touch or even the feeling it gave, it was the same. There was no difference at all. But this land was so strange, as if it was the most sturdy existence in the universe. It seemed that no matter how much power was used, even if the entire spacetime was destroyed, it would not be able to cause any damage to this piece of land within a radius of 100 feet. It was easy to imagine how mysterious it was. In front of the thatched hut, there was a wooden table and 3 stools. It was like an ordinary person receiving guests in the mountains. There were 3 cups and a pot of tea on the table. After the 3 of them sat down, Lunatic Sword said, "It is my great fortune that you are willing to come to the world of swords today. Because no one has come for a long time, please forgive me for not being a good host." Luo Fan and Senior Rainbow Shadow smiled, and then Senior Rainbow Shadow said, "Don't talk so much nonsense. What's the point of this nonsense to us? You didn't ask us to come here today just to be polite, right? Just say what you have to say." Facing Senior Rainbow Shadow's impolite words, Lunatic Sword smiled slightly. He naturally did not care. To cultivators at the Golden Immortal Realm, everything they saw and thought pointed directly to the essence, and they were naturally able to see the truth behind any words they heard and completely see through all empty words and politeness. So he wasn't surprised that Rainbow Shadow and Luo Fan were able to discern that he was different from what he'd said, and it was even to the extent that, conversely, he would be extremely surprised if they were unable to notice it. "I knew I couldn't hide it from the 2 of you. Although today is the first time we met, I believe that with our cultivation as innate Grand Luo cultivators, this should not be an obstacle for us to understand each other." Lunatic Sword smiled. Of course. Senior Rainbow Shadow also smiled. Luo Fan naturally did not have any objections. He also nodded, but did not say anything similar to what Senior Rainbow Shadow said. However, he also agreed with Lunatic Sword's words. This Dongtian was created by Lunatic Sword. It could be said that it was the direct display of Lunatic Sword's heart. Wandering in this Dongtian was equivalent to wandering in Lunatic Sword's heart. Every bit of understanding of this Dongtian was a bit of understanding of Lunatic Sword's heart. In other words, after coming to this place, Lunatic Sword's heart could be said to be completely unmasked. Therefore, although it was the first time he met Lunatic Sword, it could be said that his understanding of Lunatic Sword had reached a depth that ordinary people could only reach after tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of years. Although Lunatic Sword's understanding of the 2 of them did not reach this level, when the 2 of them were constantly observing the sword world, Lunatic Sword was also using the sword world to sense the changes in their emotions. Through this change, even ordinary people with considerable intelligence could have a deep understanding of the 2 of them, let alone Lunatic Sword, who had already become an innate Grand Luo. Therefore, although it was the first time the three of them met, it could be said that their understanding of each other had reached a level that could only be achieved after a long period of time. Under such circumstances, the fact that the three of them could still sit here and talk so peacefully was enough to prove the degree of congeniality between the three of them. In that case, I won't hide it any more. This time, I invited the two of you here to ask for your help, Lunatic Sword said with a smile. Oh, let's hear it. Luo Fan listened and asked before Rainbow Shadow Venerable could speak. Rainbow Shadow Venerable nodded and said, I'm also very interested. With your cultivation, it's obvious that you're a bit stronger than us. What else can we help with? Lunatic Sword was silent for a while. While he remained silent, the entire world of swords seemed to have undergone some sort of inexplicable change. Faintly, a bolt of lightning that could destroy time and space rumbled in the depths of the world. It was as if the entire world of swords was being shaken by this indescribable bolt of lightning. At the same time, an inexplicable and powerful aura gradually emanated from Lunatic Sword's body. This aura was not the aura of power, but a firm will and an indescribable heroic spirit. Seeing this, Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Venerable could not help but sit up straight. They knew that this meant that what Lunatic Sword was about to say would be extremely shocking. My jade splits the sky. Lunatic Sword suddenly raised his head, his eyes burning, and said word by word. As soon as these 4 words came out, Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Venerable's expression changed greatly. Luo Fan's eyes narrowed to the size of a needle. The thunder that was originally faintly rumbling in the depths of this sword world instantly broke through the endless barriers and descended upon this sword world. Under this thunder, the entire sword world shook violently. Countless spider web-like cracks instantly covered the entire sword world. The entire world almost collapsed in an instant. Fortunately, this thunder only appeared for a moment. After a flash, it completely disappeared without a trace. The impact on this world also gradually weakened. The spider web-like cracks also gradually disappeared, and the entire world gradually returned to normal. And the aura emanating from Lunatic Sword also gradually disappeared. Obviously, after saying these words, his state of mind had gradually returned to its original calmness, and became no different from before. For cultivators, as long as they cultivated to the innate golden core, they could use various means to build a relatively complete world. After reaching the innate Grand Luo, they could directly build a world that could reproduce countless living beings and all kinds of worlds that were more advanced than a medium-class world. From this, it seemed that splitting the heavens and splitting the earth was not difficult for innate Grand Luo cultivators. However, it depended on what kind of world it was. The world created by an ordinary innate golden core cultivator could only be attached to the Earth universe. It could not even produce its own vitality, could not be separated from the space-time of the Earth universe, and could not even distort, speed up, or slow down the flow of time within the world. Such a world could at most be regarded as a relatively complete storage space, and could hardly be called a real world. However, when one reached the innate Grand Luo cultivation, the ability to create a world would improve tremendously. The world created was already extremely complete. Not only could it produce countless living beings, it could produce its own vitality, and it could even be relatively independent from the space-time of the Earth universe. Distorting and slowing down the flow of time was no longer difficult for innate Grand Luo cultivators. Such a world was not much different from a truly complete and independent world, but it still belonged to the Earth universe and was still affected by the space-time of the Earth universe. The most direct manifestation of this influence was that if the Earth universe was destroyed, or even if the entire Earth universe was destroyed, the destruction of the space-time that was connected to the Dong world would be enough to completely destroy the Dong world. In addition to this most direct manifestation, there were also various other incredible manifestations. For example, the Dong world was still controlled by the great Tao of the Earth universe, still affected by the flow of time, and still unable to escape the various tribulations of the Earth universe. Since Lunatic's sword was already an innate Grand Luo cultivator, these kinds of worlds were naturally not difficult for him. He could even create countless worlds with just a thought. Since he said it so solemnly, it naturally could not represent the above worlds, but a real world that could escape the Earth universe, a world that could truly be on the same level as the Earth universe, a world that could truly escape the control of the great Tao of the Earth universe, and the space-time of the Earth universe. After a long time, Rainbow Shadow Lord frowned and said, "Are you tired of living?" This sentence was naturally not meant by ordinary people in the mortal world when they scolded or ridiculed each other, but it really meant it literally. Creating a real world is something that even the sages can't do. Back then, the great god of chaos, Pangu, had to die when he created the universe. Although your cultivation is higher than ours, you're hundreds of millions of times weaker than the sages, let alone the great god Pangu. If you insist on creating the world, it's still a small matter. I'm afraid that all traces of the existence of the infinite space-time will be completely erased. Luo Fan frowned and said, "Death meant the complete disappearance of the spirit, the origin of life, the body, and the life imprint. This was naturally an extremely terrifying ending for a living being, but compared to the erasure of the existence of the infinite space-time, this was nothing. Because after death, his life still existed in the memories of many living beings. There were still many living beings that remembered his existence. Before he died, he still existed in the past. With all these existences, in the future, if a powerful being had some fortuitous encounter, with the help of various special methods, it might be possible for him to be reborn. And if the existence of the infinite space-time was erased, then all the memories of the living beings in the universe related to his existence would be completely erased. Whether it was the past or the future, he would no longer exist. Even if one traveled back to the past, he would not be able to see any trace of his existence. Under such circumstances, no matter what realm the powerful being's cultivation reached, no matter what method he used, no matter what fortuitous encounter he borrowed, he would not be able to be reborn. What family, what friends, what disciples, what love, what legendary reputation, everything would have nothing to do with him from then on. In other words, erasing the traces of his existence in the infinite space-time was the ultimate end, eternal despair. I naturally know this. After revealing his plan, Sword Lunatic was already relaxed. At this moment, he smiled and said, "But, so what? Even if I absolutely can't succeed, even if it will erase all traces of my existence, I will still be satisfied." Faintly, there seemed to be some kind of incomparably mysterious light coming out of Sword Lunatic's face. It was a kind of light that gave everything, knowing that it was impossible, but still did it. It represented his awareness of being willing to abandon everything for the sake of the great Tao. After saying this, Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Lord were silent again. Luo Fan did not know what Rainbow Shadow Lord was thinking, but Luo Fan himself fell into an inexplicable shock. He suddenly realized that his understanding of Sword Lunatic might still be on the surface. His understanding of the many innate Zenith Heaven cultivators in this universe might also be on the surface. Can I do this for the sake of the great Tao? Luo Fan couldn't help but ask himself in his heart. The answer to this question was not unexpected. For a powerful existence like Luo Fan, it was naturally impossible for ordinary people to deceive themselves like that. It was naturally impossible for the situation where one could not do it but felt that one could do it before it happened. Therefore, Luo Fan knew very well that he could not do this at all. Not to mention the price to pay, even if all traces of the infinite space-time were to be erased, even if he died, he would never be able to accept this answer. Luo Fan couldn't help but look at the sword madman with admiration. However, although he admired him, he still did not intend to change his mind. He still would not pay the price of dying or being erased to seek the great Tao. He sought the great Tao not just for this process, not just to understand the truth of the great Tao, but to escape from the heavens and the earth, the universe, space-time, destiny, and finally escape from the chaos. It could be said that to him, seeking the great Tao was only a means for him to accomplish his goal. He had boundless respect for the great Tao, was extremely shocked by its vastness, and was extremely envious of its all-encompassing nature. However, he would absolutely not give up his own existence for the sake of seeking the great Tao. Under such circumstances, perhaps he would admire Sword Lunatic's will, comprehension, and resolution, but he would absolutely not agree with Sword Lunatic's actions or learn from Sword Lunatic. However, the will of an innate zenith heaven cultivator was peerlessly firm, and even a saint was unable to change it. Since Sword Lunatic had already made a decision, then no matter what Luo Fan said, it would probably be impossible to change his mind. Luo Fan was an innate zenith heaven cultivator himself, so he naturally knew this. Thus, he did not intend to persuade Sword Lunatic. After he recovered from his shock, he wholeheartedly considered Sword Lunatic's suggestion and pondered if he should join in. Read. Chapter 648. Luo Fan pondered for a long time. In the end, he still couldn't resist the feeling of seeing the process of opening the heavens and earth. He sighed and said, "If I can watch fellow Taoist open the heavens, it will be of great benefit to my cultivation. Fellow Taoist, please tell me what you want me to do. If it's possible, I won't refuse." He didn't directly say, "I'll wait," nor did he directly promise to take on everything. He didn't directly say, "I'm waiting," nor did he directly agree to do everything. After all, this was related to his life. Naturally, he couldn't help the rainbow shadow make the decision. Also, because this was so important, he couldn't just do everything himself. To know that if he wasn't careful, all traces of his existence would be erased. Rainbow Shadow also sighed, "You're too big. Tell me about it. If possible, count me in too." Jian Fanatic Sword was ecstatic. He left his seat and bowed to Luo Fan and the Rainbow Shadow. He said, "Thank you for your kindness. Please accept my bow." Luo Fan and Senior Rainbow Shadow hurriedly returned the greeting. After the ceremony, the three of them sat down again. Since Jian Fanatic Sword dared to ask for Luo Fan and the Rainbow Shadow, he naturally had the confidence that they would agree to what he wanted them to do. Therefore, when Luo Fan and the Rainbow Shadow each said those words, it meant that this was a done deal. That was why there was such etiquette. After sitting down, Jian Fanatic Sword said, "I have been preparing for this for billions of years. Back then, I destroyed your residence to prepare for this." As he spoke, he casually waved his hand, and the wooden table turned into a chaotic state of meng meng meng. Then, the image began to change. Gradually, it became clear and turbid, revealing a boundless universe. There were billions and billions of strange dots of light. They weren't stars, they were galaxies. Inside each dot of light, there were billions and billions of stars. The entire void of the universe was vast and boundless, and there was a vast and boundless aura rushing towards them. This made Luo Fan and Supreme Rainbow Shadow instantly realize that what was shown above was the entire Earth universe. The void of this universe continued to develop and expand. Behind it, there were billions of strange worlds that were attached to the void of this universe and were born. The way these worlds existed was very mysterious. They existed behind the cosmic void, and their auras were mixed with the vast and boundless aura of the cosmic void, causing the aura of the cosmic void to gradually change, producing all kinds of rules and laws that originally did not exist in the cosmic void. These changes were naturally invisible to ordinary people. At this moment, if a mortal or a cultivator who had yet to attain the connate grand heavenly immortal realm came here, they would only be able to see a boundless void. At most, they would be able to see the countless specks of light that contained even more marvelous existences. They would not be able to see the heaven and earth behind the void, the aura emanated by the heaven and earth, or the changes caused by the heaven and earth in the void of the universe. Book Me Group 2. This was because these changes were extremely mysterious. They couldn't be described with words, images, or any other information carriers that living beings could think of. Only the supreme senses of an innate Grand Luo realm cultivator could clearly sense the existence of these changes. If one wasn't an innate Grand Luo realm cultivator, they wouldn't be able to sense or see any of these changes. In the eyes of Luo Fan and the other two, the universe's changes didn't stop. They were still constantly changing. All sorts of rules and nomological laws changed throughout the void of the universe, gradually triggering the reaction of some inconceivable existence in the void of the universe. Under this reaction, countless mysterious life forces were born everywhere in the void of the universe, and they developed rapidly. Gradually, they developed into an endless and prosperous civilization, and countless living beings emerged. There were also countless powerful living beings who pursued the great Tao. They gradually cultivated supreme divine abilities, transcended their original living environment, and gradually came into contact with the inconceivable existence in the unseen world. Luo Fan finally understood. It turned out that this was the entire process from the birth of the universe to the birth of the first batch of powerful cultivators. Of course, this was clearly only a part of it. In other words, it was only showing the process from a very superficial point of view. After all, who was the one who created the world? The entire process of the creation of the world? How the infinite void of the universe was born? What was the role of the mysterious existence in the process of the birth? None of this was revealed at all. Even so, the light and shadows were unimaginably precious. Everything shown by the light and shadows pointed to the development process of the universe's creation. It showed the source of the birth of all living beings in the universe. For cultivators, this was to completely display the most fundamental aspect, the aspect that was closest to the Grand Tao. It allowed cultivators to know what to do in the future so that they could approach the Tao more easily. The light and shadows on the table were still constantly changing. Ordinary people might only be able to see the changing light and shadows, but for Rainbow Shadow Venerable and Luo Fan, the amount of information contained in the light and shadows had reached an incredible level. The amount of information gushing out at every moment was enough to make an ordinary connate cultivator with a leakless gold core explode and turn him into dust. This amount of information was a considerable amount of pressure even for Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Venerable. It made them feel as if their minds and willpower had begun to expand in a frenzy, receiving the endless amount of information at all times. They frantically absorbed the entire development process of the Earth and the universe from ancient times to the present that was displayed in it. They tried their best to sense the development network hidden within and tried their best to extract its essence. After an unknown period of time, the light and shadows on the table suddenly collapsed and turned back into a gray, chaotic state. In the end, it slowly faded and gradually disappeared without a trace. At this moment, Luo Fan and Reverend Rainbow Shadow suddenly closed their eyes. The aura on their bodies could not be suppressed. It was faintly discernible and spread in all directions. Gradually, it spread to the entire island, then to the outside, to the entire world of swords. Finally, it hit the edge of the world of swords and bounced back. It kept repeating in this world. Both of them were cultivators at the innate golden immortal realm. Even though their auras were different, the essence of both of them contained a strand of perfection intent. So, when it spread out into the surroundings, it caused the entire world of swords to be affected as well, and it seemed to be tainted by this strand of perfection intent. After a long time, the two of them came back to their senses. They both bowed to the pale sword maniac. "Thank you, fellow Taoist." Other living beings might not know what those light and shadows were, but Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Venerable knew very well that it was clearly Sword Maniac's memories of the universe from the birth of the universe until now. The amount of these memories was enormous. It had been trillions of years since the universe was born until now, and the eras that appeared within it had gone through hundreds of millions of eras. Obviously, it was impossible for Sword Maniac to experience those memories himself. After all, if he experienced those memories himself, he would have either become a supreme saint or perished a long time ago. How could he still be standing before Luo Fan and the others? How could he still be a Sciention Zenith Heaven cultivator? After all, Sciention Zenith Heaven cultivators were practically omnipotent in the eyes of ordinary cultivators, and they seemed to be extremely powerful and terrifying. However, only true Sciention Zenith Heaven cultivators knew that they were just ants before the universe, and they were just leaves that drifted with the flow of time before the flow of time. It would be fine if the flow of time did not repel the existence of Sciention Zenith Heaven cultivators. However, if the flow of time wanted Sciention Zenith Heaven cultivators to perish, then Sciention Zenith Heaven cultivators like them had no ability to escape the fate of perishing. They could only perish along with the flow of time. Since the creation of the universe until now, the universe had experienced over 100 million eras. So, even if a 10,000th of them rejected Sciention Zenith Heaven cultivators, it would absolutely be a calamity to them. Not to mention that amongst these 100 million eras, over a tenth of them rejected Sciention Zenith Heaven cultivators. Since it wasn't Sword Maniac's own memories, then it could only be the memories he'd gathered through various methods, divine abilities, magic treasures, objects, vital energy, or other living beings. Merely this alone was sufficient to show how precious these memories were, and it was worthy of Luo Fan and the Rainbow Shadow Exalt's bow. Not to mention that these memories directly displayed the development of the entire Earth's universe without concealment, allowing the two of them to directly see the most fundamental origin of the Earth's universe. In terms of temperament, they had even transcended the constraints of the era. Was this not worthy of their thanks? What he'd done earlier was obviously not easy for Sword Maniac. At this moment, not only was his face pale, even the ball of Zenith Heaven behind him seemed to have become much more illusory. He grinned and said, "If I want the two of you to help me, then I naturally have to let the two of you know the source and whereabouts. The profundities of my creation are hidden within those memories. I wonder if the two of you have noticed it?" When Luo Fan and the Rainbow Shadow Exalt received his reminder, the boundless memories from before flashed within their minds. In their days, they'd already understood what Sword Maniac meant, and they grinned and nodded. Seeing them nod, Sword Maniac knew that he didn't have to explain anymore. Thus, he said to the two of them, "I've exhausted too much energy, and I need to properly recuperate before I can act. I hope the two of you can wait for a period of time. Go ahead. I've comprehended quite a bit from those memories, and I intend to seize this opportunity to properly organize them." Luo Fan smiled. The Rainbow Shadow Exalt also waved his hand and said, "Don't talk so much nonsense. If you don't recover to your peak before you act, I'm worried that agreeing to your request would be too rash." Sword Maniac nodded at the two of them, then got up and walked into the straw hut to recuperate. Meanwhile, Luo Fan and the Rainbow Shadow Exalt sat at the table in front of the straw hut and casually drank tea. They didn't talk and just stared blankly into the distance. It was as if their eyes had directly pierced through the endless space-time and directly saw some strange existence in the endless distance. Luo Fan didn't know what the Rainbow Shadow Exalt saw, but Luo Fan himself had directly seen through the entire Sword World. He directly passed through the space-time of the Sword World and shined into the Earth's universe, observing the boundless Earth's universe from an extremely macroscopic angle. The Sword World was a completely different space-time from the Earth's universe. It was born from Sword Maniac's heart and was a world, a space-time between reality and illusion. Before this, because Luo Fan didn't understand the Sword World at all, he naturally couldn't see through this space-time, let alone know in what way this space-time was connected to the Earth's universe. But at this moment, after receiving the infusion of Sword Maniac's memories, he not only had a deep understanding of the sword world, but his understanding of the Earth's universe had also increased by tens of thousands of times. Under such circumstances, the factors that originally prevented him from seeing through the space-time naturally couldn't stop him at all, and he directly saw through everything. In fact, the sword world was not a naturally formed world outside the Earth's universe, nor was it a world attached to the Earth's universe like other worlds. The sword world was actually still in the Earth's universe. In other words, the sword world could be found somewhere in the void of the Earth's universe. However, it was absolutely impossible for any living creature to see the sword world through ordinary means. The reason for this was that although the sword world was in the Earth's universe, it didn't exist in it like a star. Instead, it broke the gap between time and space, and was a world that was created in the gap between space-time. The gap between space-time was an extremely mysterious form of existence. This form of existence was beyond time and space. As long as one could freely travel between the gap between space-time, one could freely travel between the past and the future, and freely travel between any location in the universe. In the past, Luo Fan traveled between the past and the future with the help of the space-time travel method obtained from the god of space-time. It was also because of this that he knew what kind of existence the time flow of the Earth's universe was. Chapter 649. The time of a cultivator is really worthless. After understanding how much time had passed, such a thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. However, this thought obviously only flashed through his mind. After all, Luo Fan was already familiar with this rhythm, and his occasional sighs of emotion were only because of the influence of the rhythm before he transmigrated. You actually recovered so quickly after exhausting so much energy. Fellow Taoist, you really are almighty. No wonder you can think of things that others don't dare to think of. At this moment, Rainbow Shadow recovered from his shock and chuckled. Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh with emotion when he heard that. Looks like there's still quite a gap between the rhythm of time between me and the innate golden immortal that was born on Earth. It's just that I've prepared more appropriately. If I didn't make all those preparations, I'm afraid I'd have to spend 10 times more time to recover to my current peak. Sword Maniac smiled lightly. I wonder if the two of you have gained anything during these 10,000 years? Sword Maniac smiled, and then he changed the topic and asked. Rainbow Shadow and Luo Fan looked at each other and smiled. They just nodded slightly, but they didn't say anything about what they'd gained. This was normal. It was naturally impossible for the two of them to not gain anything during these 10,000 years. However, those gains were extremely profound, and they were existences that couldn't be described with words. With their ability to describe, they would probably have to spend an unknown amount of time before they could barely describe it. However, it was obviously not necessary at this moment. Sword Maniac naturally understood the reason behind this, so he didn't pursue the matter and said, "Since it's like that, then let's not delay any further. How about we start right now?" Hearing those words, Luo Fan and Exalted Rainbow Shadow's faces turned solemn. They both nodded their heads and agreed that it should be so. As soon as he finished speaking, Sword Maniac shook slightly, and the entire sword dimension instantly collapsed. It transformed into boundless sword light, sword intent, sword chi, and various other existences that were related to the sword madly condensed towards the golden immortal behind Sword Maniac's head and madly surged into it. In the blink of an eye, all of them had condensed into the golden immortal, causing the sword light above the golden immortal to become even more dazzling. The ball of air that represented the golden immortal had become many times more condensed than before, and it was practically showing the characteristics of a solid state. It revealed a strange crystalline and translucent luster. Clearly, the grand heavenly immortal had obtained the infinite existences related to the sword and obtained some sort of inconceivable improvement. This meant that Jian Fanatic's cultivation realm had improved tremendously because of this. After the entire sword realm crumbled, and returned to Jian Fanatic's Grand Luo Fan and the other two appeared in an extremely mysterious dimensional rift. Around them, there was only the straw hut and a few dozen feet of flat land around it. However, this existence was extremely incomplete. It was like a disk floating in the void, and it seemed so strange and dangerous. Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Honored Man weren't surprised that the thatched cottage could survive in the spacetime gap. Their expressions didn't change at all. Instead, they carefully observed the spacetime gap around them and verified the wonders of it with what they had comprehended in the past 10,000 years. The comprehension of the past 10,000 years was great for Luo Fan, and it allowed him to vaguely grasp the essence and profundities of Earth's universe. However, it was much more beneficial to Rainbow Shadow Honored Man than to Luo Fan. Although the Rainbow Shadow Exalted Celestial Rainbow Shadow was a connate grand heavenly immortal realm cultivator that far surpassed other connate grand heavenly immortal realm cultivators and could even hide in another connate grand heavenly immortal realm cultivator's cave without being detected by that connate grand heavenly immortal realm cultivator, he was still a slightly special connate grand heavenly immortal realm cultivator. Although Rainbow Shadow Honored Man had a considerable understanding of spacetime, he hadn't reached the level where he could transcend spacetime and travel between the past and the future. After comprehending and organizing the past 10,000 years, Rainbow Shadow Honored Man could easily hover in the spacetime gap. His eyes could even easily see through the boundless spacetime without being obstructed by the layers of spacetime. For therefore 8065 with these various abilities, he clearly possessed the ability to freely travel between the past and the future. This was equivalent to transcending time itself, compared to before, when it was already limited by time and could only flow along with the flow of time. It had already undergone a fundamental change, as if it had been reborn. The benefits could be imagined. Clearly, this was not all of the benefits that the Rainbow Shadow Sovereign had obtained in the past 10,000 years. Even his aura seemed to have increased by quite a bit. As for what else he had comprehended during that period of time, it was not something that could be seen from the surface. After Jian Fanatic withdrew the sword realm into the grand heavenly immortal behind his head, the sword light in his eyes gradually faded. At first glance, it seemed to have disappeared, but if one looked closely, one would notice that the sword light had become countless times stronger. It had reached the point where things would move in the opposite direction when they reached an extreme, and it finally became invisible. At this moment, he didn't stop. He raised a finger, and a sword light suddenly shook and charged out from the grand heavenly immortal behind his head. The sword light was extremely pure, and it contained boundless profundities. It contained all the principles related to the sword, as well as sword intent that transcended spacetime. It possessed supreme power that surpassed the universe and spacetime. As soon as the sword light appeared, it seemed to have torn apart some sort of extremely strange existence. It tore open an extremely small crack in the spacetime gap, but if one looked closely, they would notice that it had become extremely vast. The spacetime gap was originally a place of nothingness that didn't even have time or space. For such an incredible existence to be torn open, it was simply indescribable. However, Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Honored Man weren't surprised at all. The two of them moved at the same time, raising their hands and slapping towards the crack. In an instant, the grand heavenly immortal of different sizes behind their heads trembled, and endless mysterious patterns charged out from their grand heavenly immortal. What charged out from the grand heavenly immortal behind Luo Fan's head were endless, extremely complicated, and extremely profound runes. These runes were all formed from the condensation of a mysterious gas similar to the grand heavenly immortal chi. Each of them contained an incredible aura that surpassed time and space. After all the runes left the grand heavenly immortal, they instantly entangled and condensed in the void, gradually outlining an extremely simple, and even extremely crude rune universe. This rune universe was countless times simpler than the endless miniature universe constructed by Luo Fan's arcane treasure. There was only a gray void with no visible boundaries. There were no galaxies, no stellar systems, and no planets or moons. If it wasn't for the fact that there was a complete space-time within it, as well as the vast aura that a real universe could exude, no one would treat this endless space-time as a universe. However, as soon as such a simple and crude rune universe appeared, it naturally produced unimaginable power. It directly formed an extremely short but truly strange space-time within the space-time crack. This characteristic was clearly not something that the miniature universe created by the arcane treasure could possess. With this characteristic, it meant that this extremely simple universe already possessed a supreme characteristic that surpassed the major chiliocosm. The space of the Earth universe itself was rather fragile, but it was essentially a world that was one level higher than the major chiliocosm. It was essentially no different from the primordial world that Luo Fan had transmigrated to. The reason why there was such a huge difference in the strength of space and the stability of time compared to the space and time of the primordial world was not because the essence of the Earth universe was lower, but because the time and space of the Earth universe were separated by eras. In other words, the reason why the Earth universe had such a special characteristic was that the distribution of the strength of space and the stability of time in the Earth universe was not uniform. It might be difficult to understand, but if a small analogy was used, it could completely show the difference between the Earth universe and the primordial world. If space-time was treated as a river of sand without a head or tail, then the river of sand that represented the primordial world would be an extremely flat river. The thickness of the sand in any section was no different from the thickness of the sand in other parts of the world. On the other hand, the river of sand that represented the Earth universe was undulating. In some places, the sand was only thin, and it was thousands of times thinner than a piece of paper. In some places, the sand was piled up extremely thick, and there was even a river of sand that was taller than a mountain. To the Earth universe, the sections of the river of sand that were piled up higher than a mountain were the barriers between the two eras. The other sections of the river of sand that were thousands of times thinner than a piece of paper were obviously all the other space-time barriers between the two eras. Because of this, although the space and time of the primordial world were extremely stable, as long as a cultivator transcended space-time, he could freely travel between the infinitely distant past and the infinitely distant future. Unless the world was created or the world was destroyed, no other time period could be an obstacle. In the space of the Earth universe, one did not even need to reach the Golden Core realm. As long as a cultivator had a certain cultivation level, he could use some special techniques to distort space and even let his divine sense travel through time. However, even if his cultivation reached the level of a sage, he would need to spend countless methods and pay an unbelievable price to break through the barriers between the two eras. At this moment, the runic universe that Luo Fan had constructed with the help of the infinite runes was the greatest gain he had obtained from the memories of the sword maniac over the past 10,000 years. This simple universe naturally could not compare to the Earth universe, nor could it compare to the primordial world. However, it conformed to a certain source hidden under the incomparably complex rules and laws of the Earth universe. This source was one of the infinite sources of the Earth universe. It was not of a higher level than the other sources, nor was it closer to the Great Way than the other sources. However, it was enough to enhance the essence of the runic universe, allowing it to surpass all the universes that Luo Fan had created in the past, allowing it to possess a certain special characteristic of the Earth universe. This special characteristic allowed the runic universe to surpass the vast thousand world. And precisely because the source that Luo Fan had comprehended was only one of the infinite sources of the Earth universe, the runic universe appeared extremely simple and crude. Even the matter and energy within it had not been separated, and had not truly evolved. After this simple universe took shape, it directly appeared on the side of the strange crack that the sword maniac had sliced open, fixing one of the edges of the crack in place. At the same time, a long rainbow formed from countless strange rainbow shadows appeared on the other side of the crack. It gave off an unbelievable power and directly fixed the other side of the crack in place, causing the originally merging crack to instantly stop. The crack was like a black line fixed in the space-time gap, stabilizing there without moving at all. The strange rainbow was naturally formed from the infinite rainbow shadows produced by the zenith heaven behind the Rainbow Shadow Lord's head. The rainbow shadows were extremely strange. They were somewhat similar to runes, but their essence was completely different. They seemed to be real, and their essence seemed to be extremely illusory. However, they possessed a strange feeling that was more realistic than any physical existence. Every rainbow shadow was like a rune. They were compatible with some kind of strange Tao mark and carried some kind of mystery of the Great Way. It was a system that was different from the runic system, but equally profound and unfathomable, describing the Great Way. These rainbow shadows formed a long rainbow, just like how Luo Fan had used runes to form a formation. The method was different, but the essence was the same. In those 10,000 years, Luo Fan had been able to comprehend a certain source of the Earth universe through his various experiences, allowing the runic universe that he had opened to possess characteristics that surpassed the Great Thousand World. The Rainbow Shadow Lord's harvest was even greater than Luo Fan's, so it was naturally not much worse than Luo Fan's. However, he had also comprehended some kind of truth that surpassed space-time. At that moment, the endless rainbow shadows he had released were directly explaining this truth that could not be described with words. The rainbow seemed to be just a ray of light, but in reality, it was formed from countless rainbow shadows. Its structure was exquisite and complicated, reaching a realm that could not be described with words. All the rainbow-colored shadows gathered together. Although black was barely able to express that kind of power, with the profoundness of the rainbow-colored shadows, it allowed this long rainbow to possess a supreme might that surpassed space and time. Because of this, it could form an independent body in the space-time gap. Although it was not a world, not a space-time, not a universe, it could still do what Luo Fan's runic universe could do, and that was to fix the other side of the crack. This caused the strange crack that was gradually merging to stop instantly. Fixing the crack was what Mad Sword needed the help of Luo Fan and the Rainbow Shadow Lord. The crack could appear in the space-time gap, so its essence naturally surpassed time, surpassed space, and even surpassed the Earth universe in some aspects. But at the same time, the appearance of the crack would naturally suffer the backlash of the Earth universe. If there was no existence that also surpassed space-time to fix the two sides of the crack would be destroyed by the backlash of the Earth universe the moment it appeared. There would not even be any time interval between the entire process. However, at that moment the crack had already been fixed. But one could imagine how powerful the backlash of the entire unbelievably vast Earth universe was to erase the crack. It was obviously impossible for the two connate Grand Luo Realm cultivators, Luo Fan and the Rainbow Shadow Lord, to really fix the crack. After fixing the crack, Luo Fan and the Rainbow Shadow Lord felt an endless power acting on their runic universe and the rainbow. Among them, Luo Fan's runic universe had formed a universe after all. Even if it was so simple that it could not be described, it was still a universe that had some characteristics of the Earth universe. Compared to the rainbow that could only describe some kind of truth, its essence was much higher. Therefore, although they also suffered from the backlash of the Earth universe, the power provided by Luo Fan to resist the backlash was many times weaker than what the Rainbow Shadow Lord needed to resist. In addition, Luo Fan had relied on his own understanding of the origin of the Earth universe to construct the runic universe. Although it consumed a lot of energy, it was countless times less than the Rainbow Shadow Venerable, who forcibly used the infinite rainbow shadows to construct that long rainbow. Adding these two situations together, the Rainbow Shadow Lord seemed to be much more powerful than Luo Fan due to the accumulation of power over a long period of time, but it seemed to be much more strenuous than Luo Fan. Moreover, while Luo Fan still seemed to be at ease, the Rainbow Shadow Lord's face had already turned pale, and his body was trembling slightly. The rainbow that was fixed on the other side also became slightly shaky, as if it would collapse at any time. Compared to the stability of the runic universe that Luo Fan built on the other side, the difference was like heaven and earth. I can only hold on for 3 seconds at most. A thought was transmitted from Luo Fan, and it was directly received by Jian Feng and the Rainbow Shadow Lord. I can only hold on for 2.5 seconds. The Rainbow Shadow Lord received the thought and sent a thought as well. That's enough. Jian Feng was overjoyed as he sent out a thought. He dashed toward the crack without hesitation and instantly disappeared in the space-time gap. A snap of a finger was 60 seconds. One could imagine how short a moment was. An ordinary person would not even have a thought flashing through their mind before the 60 seconds passed. However, that was only for ordinary people. For innate Zenith Heaven Realm cultivators, a snap of a finger was as long as 1,000 years. To them, a split second was equivalent to a period of time for them to make countless decisions, perform countless actions, and perform countless technique. Under such circumstances, the exchange of wills between the three of them did not take up any time at all. To Frenzied Sword, there was no delay at all. In the eyes of an ordinary person, it seemed like Jian Fanatic had raised his hand to release a ray of light that tore open a spatial rift, and then a talisman universe and a ray of light had locked the rift in place. After that, Jian Fanatic had practically charged into the rift without the slightest delay. Whoosh. Chapter 650. Both Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Sr. knew that whether or not Jian Feng could really split the heavens and earth depended on the 2.5 seconds that the rift existed. Text first. Therefore, the moment the crazy sword charged into the crack, their consciousnesses followed right behind it and charged into the crack as well. Behind the rift, time, space, matter, energy, and everything else was an indescribable Huanluan. It was the Hun chaos outside of the Earth's universe. This Hun chaos had an incredible strangling power. Before all living beings became sages, this Hun chaos was an existence that they could not approach. Once they entered it, they would be strangled and obliterated. However, at this moment, the moment Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Sr.'s consciousnesses rushed into the rift, they suddenly felt an indescribable power suddenly acting on their consciousnesses. This allowed their consciousnesses to stabilize in the Hun chaos. The endless strangling power of the Hun chaos could not break through the obstruction of this power and hurt their consciousnesses. This is the power of the Earth's universe. In an instant, Luo Fan came to this realization. The Earth's universe was a supreme universe on the same level as the untainted universe. It could also exist in the Hun chaos forever as a beacon of the Hun chaos. One could imagine how powerful the power of the Earth's universe was. Naturally, Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Sr. had not truly become sages. Logically speaking, the Hun chaos should be an existence that they could not approach. As soon as their consciousnesses entered it, they would be directly obliterated. They would not be able to see anything. However, the two of them were currently in a space-time rift. It was a place that was separated from all space-time in the Earth's universe. This place was a void that repelled everything. Even the Hun chaos was repelled by this space-time rift. At this moment, their consciousnesses were in a state where they were about to leave the space-time rift. Naturally, there was a repulsive force generated from the space-time rift behind them. This showed that there was a strange power around their consciousnesses that protected them. This prevented the Hun chaos from breaking through the barrier of this power and hurting their consciousnesses. There was no time or space in the chaotic state of the Hun. As a result, they could chase after Jian Fanatic through the crack at any moment. However, the distance between their consciousnesses and Jian Fanatic was extremely strange. It was as if their consciousnesses were stuck close to Jian Fanatic, yet it was also as if they were billions of miles away from him. But no matter what, both of them saw everything that Jian Fanatic did. At this moment, Jian Fanatic didn't seem to have changed, but he gave off a feeling that he had turned into a sword. It was a sword that was millions of miles long and contained unimaginable power. He stood there, and the obscure light in his eyes instantly increased by many times. He stared closely at the point in front of him. As more than half of Luo Fan's and Rainbow Shadow Venerable's minds were still in the spacetime gap, they were protected by the power of the Earth's universe. Therefore, they could barely maintain their integrity in this chaotic state and could barely see what was happening in this chaotic state. However, Sword Maniac was not so lucky. At this moment, Sword Maniac was already far away from the crack. He had charged into the depths of the chaotic state of the Hun. If it wasn't for the close connection between Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Venerable, they might not have been able to see his existence through the chaotic state of the Hun. Under such circumstances, Sword Maniac naturally endured the impact of the boundless chaotic state of the Hun without holding back. The boundless strangulation force struck Sword Maniac's body, constantly striking and eroding him. It wanted to turn him into a chaotic state of the Hun and fuse with the surrounding chaotic state of the Hun. Logically speaking, with Sword Maniac's cultivation as a connate Grand Luo, it was impossible for him to maintain his integrity in the chaotic state of the Hun. However, Sword Maniac was extremely strange at this moment. He actually relied on the boundless sword light emitted by the Grand Luo behind his head to barely resist the impact of the chaotic state of the Hun. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say that resistance was not the case. Instead, the chaotic state of the soul was constantly destroying the boundless sword flashes, while the Grand Luo was also constantly unleashing the boundless sword flashes, barely managing to maintain the balance between destruction and unleashing. As a result, Sword Maniac's body was actually barely able to maintain his integrity in the chaotic state of the Hun. Since Sword Maniac dared to enter the chaotic state of the Hun to create a new world, he naturally had already considered everything that he might encounter. Therefore, he did not hesitate at all. He made full use of time and roared. The Grand Luo behind his head suddenly shook and transformed into a long sword that slammed towards the Hun. The Hun chaos state was all-encompassing. Great Daos, laws, and everything else were contained within it. However, the chaotic state of Hun was an extremely stable existence to begin with. Even if ordinary living beings saw the chaotic state of Hun, they would only be able to sense that it contained everything in the universe. It was basically impossible for them to comprehend its true profundities. Because of this, although the consciousness of Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Venerable had left the space-time gap, they could not comprehend anything from the Hun that they had been dreaming of. However, when the Grand Luo behind Sword Maniac's head transformed into a long sword and slammed forward, the originally extremely stable Hun was finally shaken up. This wasn't enough to split the Hun into a clear and turbid state, but it had already shaken up the originally stable state of the Hun. However, it had already caused the chaotic state of Hun to become extremely stable, but completely unable to comprehend the mysteries of quaking and swamping to be broken. This caused Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Venerable to feel an endless amount of incredible information surging into their minds through their consciousness. Their souls also endured all sorts of unimaginable impact. It was as if their souls were about to crumble and turn into powder under the impact of the huge amount of information. The information was extremely messy. Some of it described the most profound and most fundamental principles of the universe, while some were only rough descriptions of various things. The information that described the most profound and most fundamental principles of the universe made Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Venerable feel that they had gained a lot. It was as if their cultivation realm was going to rise at an unimaginable speed with the influx of information. On the other hand, the rough descriptions of various things made them feel as if they had eaten half a fly during a feast. It was extremely disappointing. However, at this moment, the two of them did not organize the information. Instead, they directly used various methods to absorb the information into their sea of consciousness, allowing the information to continuously accumulate and gather in their sea of consciousness. For the two of them, the most important thing was to see how Sword Maniac was going to split open the heavens and earth. Compared to splitting open the heavens and earth, although the information that surged into their sea of consciousness out of nowhere was rather precious, it was only secondary. Regardless of whether Sword Maniac succeeded or failed, as long as the two of them could clearly see each of his actions and the changes in the Hun caused by each of his actions, they would gain an unbelievable harvest. It was naturally impossible to directly break through realms, but it was extremely easy to advance one's cultivation realm in the Khanate perfected heavenly realm. Sword Maniac had already cultivated the way of the sword to a level that surpassed time, space, matter, and energy. This realm was equivalent to being omnipotent in the universe on Earth, and it was even to the extent that one could directly establish a world of the sword with an independent spacetime with the sword. However, that was only in the universe on Earth. In the Hun chaos, this realm was rather insignificant. The longsword that the Khanate perfected heavenly realm had transformed into continuously slashed and slashed in the Hun chaos, but it only caused various fluctuations in the Hun chaos, causing the Hun chaos to lose its stability and produce all sorts of unbelievable changes. However, it was unable to completely destroy the Hun chaos and establish a complete world. This was natural. Even Pangur had to pay the price of splitting open the heavens and earth in the Hun chaos back then. Compared to Pangu, Sword Maniac was billions of times weaker, so how could he so easily split open the Hun chaos and establish a new world? Sword Maniac had clearly expected this, so he was not surprised by the situation. Instead, as the long sword slashed and slashed, he incessantly stimulated his own power. The endless power, blood essence, and sword intent that he had accumulated over hundreds of millions of years surged madly and continuously poured into the longsword through some unimaginable and mysterious channel, causing the longsword's power, sword intent, and way of the sword to continuously improve at an unimaginable speed. As the power and other aspects of the longsword improved, the longsword's ability to destroy the Hun chaos also increased. At this moment, Sword Maniac had already poured all of his thoughts, mind, experience, and will into the longsword that the Khanate perfected heavenly realm had transformed into. As the longsword slashed and slashed at the Hun chaos, it drew a series of mysterious and indescribable trajectories. Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Sovereign, who were watching from the side, were able to comprehend many mysteries from watching the sword bombard the Hun chaos and destroy it. Naturally, Sword Maniac, who was personally attacking the Hun chaos, gained even more from the process. At almost every moment, Sword Maniac felt that his understanding of the way of the sword was deepening. The way of the sword seemed to be expanding at an impossible peak, as if a brand new world and a brand new realm were slowly opening up in front of him. As he comprehended this, the trajectories that the longsword drew through the Hun chaos became more and more precise, more and more profound, and the mysteries it contained became richer and richer. However, because he was constantly extracting the power that he had accumulated over hundreds of millions of years and the boundless essence and blood in his body, Sword Maniac's body began to change more and more clearly. His aura grew weaker and weaker, and he became more and more haggard, as if he would lose everything and die at any moment. The power of the longsword continued to rise, and the Hun chaos in the surroundings gradually underwent various changes that it had never experienced before. Time and space seemed to slowly form as the longsword continued to slash and slash. However, the power of the Hun chaos was just too terrifying. Under the pressure of the Hun chaos, The time and space formed by the longsword were destroyed almost as soon as they were formed. It was as if they had never existed. As the power of Sword Maniac's longsword continued to rise, the time and space existed longer and longer, gradually giving birth to countless unimaginable powers. Earth, water, fire, wind, metal, wood, water, fire, earth, and other origin powers began to form in the time and space. Along with the formation of these powers, the chaotic state of the Hun seemed to have skyrocketed more than 10,000 times. Even though Frenzied Sword's cultivation realm had increased by dozens of times, he could only rely on the loss of endless power to maintain his body's complete existence under the chaotic state of the Hun. At this moment, Sword Maniac was like Pangu, who had created the earth and the universe in ancient times. He floated in the boundless Hun chaos while the longsword around him continuously slashed at the Hun chaos in mysterious trajectories. Endless violent earth, water, fire, wind, metal, wood, water, fire, earth, evil chi, earth, 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 evil chi, earth, and all sorts of strange powers surrounded and destroyed him. Endless unimaginable changes kept appearing and disappearing under the longsword. The time and space created by his slashes were constantly being reconstructed in an unhurried manner and gradually stabilized. In the eyes of Luo Fan and Venerable Rainbow Shadow, every movement of Jian Feng was becoming more and more profound. Gradually, from being able to gain a lot from watching him and comprehend the profundities of the various sword daos, it was as if they were reading a heavenly book. They knew that it was extremely profound and contained inconceivable profundities, but they were unable to truly comprehend the principles within. They could only try their best to memorize these movements in their minds, hoping that they would be able to comprehend them when their cultivation realm increased in the future. After an unknown amount of time, it seemed like thousands of years, but it also seemed like only an instant. The power, essence, and sword intent that Sword Maniac could extract finally reached their limit, finally surpassing the limits of what he could bear. In an instant, Sword Maniac's entire body collapsed and directly fused with the long sword formed by Zenith Heaven. After obtaining Sword Maniac's everything, the longsword's power skyrocketed by several times. It even turned blood-red, and the blood-red power that slashed at the chaotic Hun also skyrocketed by several times. This change, coupled with the various gains that Sword Maniac had obtained from slashing at the chaotic Hun state, finally broke through the Hun state. In an instant, a complete and stable space-time instantly formed around the longsword formed by Sword Maniac. Boundless tyrannical power of earth, water, fire, wind, yin and yang energies, metal, wood, water, fire, earth, and so on filled every inch of this stable spacetime. At this moment, the sword formed from Jian Fanatic had finally exhausted all its strength, and it froze there for a long time before it let out a sigh of endless satisfaction. In the end, it completely collapsed and transformed into a formless existence that vanished without a trace. With the disappearance of the longsword, that space-time and the boundless tyrannical power within that space-time finally could not withstand the erosion of the surrounding Hun state. Under the impact of the Hun state, the space-time collapsed piece by piece and finally became invisible, completely fusing with the surrounding Hun state, as if it had never existed. At the same time, Luo Fan and Rainbow Shadow Sovereign felt an indescribable gravitational force behind them, pulling their consciousnesses back into the crack as if they had never appeared, disappearing from the Hun state. As their consciousnesses returned to the space-time crack, the backlash from Earth's universe finally reached its limit, directly shattering the runic universe created by Luo Fan and the rainbow formed by Rainbow Shadow Sovereign. As they shattered, the crack suddenly closed, disappearing without a trace as if it had never appeared. Not good. Luo Fan suddenly moved his mind, and a thought was transmitted to the infinitely distant spacetime through an incomparably mysterious spiritual channel. The moment this thought was transmitted, he seemed to have forgotten something in his trance. However, after careful analysis, he found that all his memories were so complete and there was not a trace of doubt at all. It was as if this feeling of forgetting something was just an illusion. How strange! He looked around and found that he was surrounded by an incomparably familiar space-time crack. Beside him, Rainbow Shadow Sovereign was also standing there with a blank look in his eyes. At this moment, Rainbow Shadow Sovereign suddenly chuckled and said to Luofan, "Fellow Luofan, I didn't expect to meet you here. It must be fate. Why don't we travel together?" Luofan calmed himself down and said, "Forget it. I feel a little strange today, but I'm not in the mood to play. Let's part ways here." "What a pity," Rainbow Shadow Zune said with a look of pity. Luofan smiled and took a step forward. He casually stepped into a space-time and returned to Earth. Rainbow Shadow Sovereign watched Luofan leave and frowned. He thought to himself, although my memories of coming here today seem to be complete and there's nothing suspicious, why do I feel like something is missing? He carefully pondered, but in the end, he still couldn't think of what was missing. With a sigh, his body trembled and he merged with another space-time that was different from the one Luofan had entered, disappearing into the space-time crack. At this moment, Luofan floated in the space with his brows tightly furrowed. He was trying his best to think of what had caused him to feel a little strange. However, no matter how he thought about it, the strangeness was gradually disappearing, as if the missing existence was being supplemented bit by bit. But this kind of supplement and perfection is obviously not really finding the missing existence, but more like directly making up the missing existence according to the reasonable way in his memory. Chapter 651. Just as he had this epiphany, from an unknown distance in space and time, through a mysterious channel that he could not find any trace of, a mysterious thought was transmitted to him. These were the thoughts transmitted by his main body in the distant untainted world. When he received these memories, in an instant, there were endless scenes flashing between his mind and mind. In a trance, his memories were added intermittently, just perfectly filling in the strange missing memory that he felt before. So that's how it is. All traces of the existence of the Sword Lunatic have been completely erased by the backlash force of the Earth universe. If it weren't for the fact that my body wasn't in the Earth universe, if it weren't for my quick reaction, I might have already become like the Rainbow Shadow Senior. After receiving these memories, Luofan was completely clear about why he felt so strange before. However, although it was clear, he did not dare to put it into words. There was no way to revive any memory of the Rainbow Shadow Lord about the Sword Madman. After all, the existence of the Sword Madman in the memory of any living being, in any space-time, was not something else, but the magnificent and powerful Earth universe. When the Sword Madman failed to create the world, all traces of him were erased, and it had become a supreme law of the Earth universe. Under such circumstances, it could be said that Luofan had violated the supreme rules and laws of the Sword Lunatic with the help of his main body in the untainted world. It was already a blessing that these memories were not erased. The connection between his main body and his split body was mysterious and unfathomable. If he dared to spread these memories, then even if the connection between his main body and his split body was mysterious, the supreme rules and laws of the Earth's universe would definitely be touched. At that time, there would be a supreme force descending, completely erasing his memory and the memories of the people who heard these words. At that time, he could retrieve these memories again through the connection between the main body and the split body, but the other people who heard these words would never have such an opportunity. In that case, whether he said these words or not, the result would be the same, and it would be meaningless. In this case, why should he say it? With a slight sigh, Luofan could only express his regret to Lunatic Sword and Rainbow Shadow. Naturally, he felt sorry for the Sword Lunatic because although he had barely managed to open up an unstable small world at the last moment, he ultimately failed. All traces of his existence had been erased by the Earth's universe. His regret towards the rainbow shadow exalted was that he'd lost all his memories related to the lunatic swordsman. Naturally, he'd also lost all the comprehensions he'd obtained when he watched the lunatic swordsman create the world, and he'd lost all the information he'd received at that time. Moreover, those comprehensions and information were extremely precious to any innate golden immortal realm cultivator, and it was even sufficient for them to see the existence of the path to break through. So, how could Luo Fan not feel regret? After regrets, he would not waste his time. With a slight thought in his mind, he knew where he was at this moment and the time. At this moment, he'd appeared at the corresponding location of the sword world that the lunatic swordsman had created in the spatial rift. Moreover, it had been almost 3 years since he'd entered the spatial rift. In other words, if the traces of the lunatic swordsman in all spacetime hadn't been erased, then he might still be able to see the sword world after entering the spatial rift, and he might even be able to see himself observing the Earth's universe and comprehending the quintessence of the universe from within the sword world. However, such an if was naturally impossible. With a thought in his mind, Luo Fan's figure transformed into nothingness and completely fused into space. In an instant, he'd appeared at the center of a river that was countless trillions of light years away. There was an enormous black hole at the center of this river, and the gravitational force of this black hole was extremely powerful. The spacetime within it had been completely changed by the powerful gravitational force of this black hole, and it had transformed into an extremely strange and mysterious form. In this form of spacetime, it was as if time had been suspended, and it was as if an instant in the outside world was equivalent to millions of years inside. The space seemed to have been compressed into a tiny dot that was almost indescribable in terms of size, and it also seemed like a boundless space that had been expanded to billions of times its original size. It was so mysterious that it was almost impossible to describe with words. If Luo Fan hadn't met the lunatic swordsman, even if he knew that this black hole was so mysterious, it would have been difficult for him to approach it and use it. However, after he met the lunatic swordsman, through the lunatic swordsman's memories and through his comprehension of the entire process of splitting the heavens and earth apart, the black hole no longer held any secrets for him. It was naturally not difficult to use this black hole. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan did not hesitate at all. His figure trembled, and he took a step forward, directly stepping into the black hole that possessed boundless gravitational force, and even the spacetime within it had been completely changed. The way he stepped in seemed to be a simple step, but the entire process was filled with an indescribable mystery. In an instant, his figure seemed to have turned into traces of the Tao, and the entire universe seemed to have been added to his body at this moment, making the endless gravitational force of the black hole seem non-existent to him. He was almost not affected at all as he easily made a mysterious path and entered the black hole. As soon as he entered the black hole, Luo Fan felt as if time and space had been distorted. In an instant, he felt as if he had lost all power and was thrown into a space-time gap, and he could only drift uncontrollably under the influence of the endless spacetime. This black hole was no longer a secret to him, and he had naturally expected this. Therefore, the moment this feeling appeared, the daluo behind his head trembled slightly, and strands of air instantly left the daluo behind his head and began to flow around his body in a mysterious and complicated way. As these air flows flowed, an indescribable force acted on the surrounding spacetime. Under the effect of this force, the surrounding spacetime gradually began to change, and an extremely stable spacetime with a radius of only 100 feet took shape. Luo Fan's figure was suspended in the spacetime within a radius of 100 feet. Around this spacetime, all sorts of strange colors were constantly circulating around the spacetime in a seemingly incomparably Huanluan manner. In fact, they were circulating according to some sort of extremely profound law. At this moment, Luo Fan's spiritual sense clone suddenly appeared in this spacetime out of nowhere. Luo Fan's spiritual sense clone did not follow him into the spacetime gap when he accepted Sword Lunatic's invitation. Instead, it tracked him in a unique way and finally went to the corresponding location of Sword Lunatic's Sword Realm in this universe. For the next 3 years, he had been staying there, comprehending the abnormality of that location and all the traces of the existence of the Sword Realm. Of course, the final harvest was naturally quite small. After all, the Sword Realm opened up by the Sword Lunatic was hidden in the gap of infinite space and time. Even if the spiritual sense avatar could observe everything from the perspective of the power of the Earth's cosmic origin, it was difficult to find the Sword Realm hidden in the depths. This situation continued until Luo Fan left the Sword Realm. When Luo Fan regained all the memories about Sword Lunatic, this spiritual sense clone naturally recovered all the memories. Similarly, it also possessed the various understandings that Luo Fan had gained in the Sword Realm. Although it didn't fully understand the mysteries that Luo Fan had comprehended when he watched Sword Lunatic create the world, it was enough to further improve the power of its magical power. This increase in power allowed the spiritual sense avatar to easily follow behind the main body and enter the dark cave behind the main body. This spiritual sense clone appeared at this time. Naturally, it was not just to show its existence. This spiritual sense clone was also Luo Fan. Naturally, there was no need for any communication with the main body. Their thoughts were connected and it already understood why it appeared. Immediately, 2 mysterious rays of brilliance flashed in its eyes. These 2 rays of brilliance seemed to be made of the purest power that was extremely close to the origin of the universe. After they appeared, they were operating in a very mysterious way at every moment. Every subtle movement of this operating process seemed to be projecting some profound mysteries of the Earth's universe. The whole process seemed to be projecting the great Tao into these 2 rays of brilliance in some strange way. After the brilliance appeared, Luo Fan's spiritual sense clone raised its hands and slowly sketched in the void. His movements were so slow that they seemed to be the ordinary movements of an ordinary person. They did not contain any power, but these movements seemed to be engraved in time and space, as if they were engraved in the great Tao. With every movement, the void naturally condensed with invisible, indescribable strange power. These powers included time, space, earth, water, fire, wind, the 5 elements of yin and yang, all kinds of evil qi, astral qi, and the infinite essence of the stars. Almost all forms of power that existed in the Earth's universe were included in it. These powers seemed to contain the entire universe. As the spiritual sense doppelganger moved more and more, the natural power gathered more and more. Finally, an indescribably complex trajectory was outlined in the void, forming a strange 3-dimensional pattern that densely filled the entire space within a radius of 1,000 feet. The moment this 3-dimensional pattern completely filled the entire space, the spiritual sense clone shook its hands and suddenly separated them. In an instant, the 3-dimensional pattern instantly soared hundreds of millions of times, directly breaking through the limit of the space within a radius of 300 meters. In an instant, it broke through the space-time barrier and continued to expand outwards, expanding the range of its influence. As the indescribably complex pattern continued to expand, the endless colorful strange existences around the spacetime were gradually incorporated into the pattern in some obscure and mysterious way. As the endless colorful strange existences were incorporated into the pattern, a larger and larger spacetime was gradually opened up. This spacetime directly replaced the original small spacetime with a radius of 300 meters. The stability of its space and time was far greater than that of the Earth's universe. It surpassed all the heavens he had seen, the medium-class worlds, and directly reached the level of the Great Thousand World. As this spacetime expanded, endless innate yuan qi was gradually born in this spacetime, gradually filling every inch of this spacetime, turning this spacetime into a supreme cultivation holy land that cultivators dreamed of. The pattern continued to expand. After an unknown amount of time, the pattern finally expanded to its limit and finally stabilized. At this moment, the interior of the black cave had been completely replaced by this spacetime. The entire spacetime had a circumference of 15 million kilometers. Within it, there was a land with a circumference of 10 million kilometers. Outside this land was an ocean with a circumference of 20 million kilometers. On this land were mountains, lakes, grasslands, forests, plains, mountains, rivers, and lake. Almost everything that a complete world should have existed on this land. Even the ocean was dotted with countless islands, big and small. The topography of these islands was very similar to the topography of the central land. It also had everything that a complete world should have. It was like a miniature world. The changes of the entire world did not stop at this time. Endless innate yuan qi was still being born out of thin air, gradually filling the world. Gradually, the concentration of the innate yuan qi in the entire world became higher and more terrifying. Finally, when the concentration of the innate yuan qi reached its limit and even gave birth to strands of chaotic yuan qi, the situation of the innate yuan qi being born out of thin air stopped. At this time, the huge pattern that covered the entire spacetime and the entire world suddenly collapsed, as if it had never appeared. It did not transform any power at all, but directly turned into nothingness. Sure enough, it's a bit difficult to open up the great thousand worlds. At this time, Luo Fan's spiritual sense doppelganger suddenly sighed. After sighing, his entire body shook and instantly collapsed, directly turning into two strange air currents. One of the two streams of air was extremely light, as if it had no weight at all. Even the lightest yuan qi would instantly float to the highest point. The other stream of air was extremely heavy, as if even the hardest and heaviest matter could not stop it from sinking, and would be crushed by it, causing it to sink to the bottom. As soon as these two air currents were formed, the light air current quickly floated up. In an instant it had already reached the top of the world, and the moment it reached the highest point, some incredible changes occurred. In the end, it turned into a sky full of stars, and the incomparably huge sun and moon that provided the entire world with immeasurable light. The incomparably heavy airflow instantly descended, finally breaking through the barrier of the earth, directly descending into the deepest part of the entire world. At the same time, an inconceivable change occurred, directly turning into a long river. This long river was yellow in color, and flowing on it was a strange liquefied vital energy that was extremely and turbid. Within this strange vital energy, countless strange souls were continuously being born according to some incomparably wondrous law. After these spirits were born, after swimming in this strange river for a period of time, they would trigger some mysterious laws and disappear in this river. When they disappeared, in this world above, a creature with either complete spiritual consciousness or no spiritual consciousness would be born. When any living being in the world above died, the strange river would naturally give birth to a soul. The two formed an incomparably profound cycle of reincarnation. Floating in this world, Luo Fan's mind moved, and the flow of time in this entire world accelerated to tens of millions of times that of the outside world. A year in the outside world was tens of millions of years in this world. The entire world had undergone countless earth-shattering changes in these tens of millions of years. Hundreds of highly intelligent civilizations were born and destroyed, flourishing and declining. Now, after tens of millions of years, it had actually returned to the scene before it was created. In this entire world, there were only a few low-level, ordinary creatures that barely survived. If there was anything different, it would be that the number of spirits in the river at the bottom of this world had increased to an inconceivable degree. They were practically densely packed to the brim. Apart from that, the strange river's ability to give birth to spirits had completely disappeared, so the spirits that were born in this river could only be replenished by the deaths of the creatures in the world above. The reason for this change was clearly because the number of creatures that this world could support had reached its limit, and it could no longer add any more creatures. At this time, Luo Fan's mind moved slightly, and the flow of time in this world slowed down. Finally, it reached the same speed as the flow of time in the outside world before it stopped. After everything stopped, Luo Fan let out a long breath. The paleness that was caused by the excessive consumption of energy from speeding up time slowly faded, and a rosy glow gradually appeared on his face. My ability really can't compare to the Sword Madman. The Sword Madman could barely open up a small world in the chaotic state of the Hun universe. I only opened up a great thousand world, but I actually had to pay the price of turning into a myriad of spirit. Luo Fan thought with a slightly bitter smile. This world was a rather complete great thousand world. This could already be seen from the natural evolution of this great thousand world over the past tens of millions of years. If this great thousand world was not complete, then these tens of millions of years of evolution would be enough to cause the entire world to change greatly or even directly collapse. At this time, the entire world could still maintain the state when it was first opened, and even the innate vitality was not much different from before. This was absolutely impossible if it was not a complete great thousand world. That's right, registered users could log in every day and receive Q coins. Chapter 652. After the spiritual sense doppelganger established the great thousand world, it wasn't necessary for the spiritual sense doppelganger to transform into a myriad of spirits, but it was still very difficult for the spiritual sense doppelganger to establish the great thousand world. Although it was successful in the end, when the great thousand world was established, all of its power, spirit, will, and even thoughts had been completely exhausted. His body could no longer withstand the natural attraction of the great thousand world. His body collapsed and transformed into the boundless starry sky above and the yellow springs below. As for his spirit, it was directly divided into the countless spirits in the yellow springs. Therefore, at this moment it could be said that all living beings in the great thousand world were a part of Luo Fan. All the hatred and love that happened in the great thousand world was his own hatred and love for himself. In other words, Luo Fan could be said to love himself, hate himself, feel for himself, despise himself, torture himself, and kill himself in the great thousand world. He was his own ancestor, and he was his own descendant. This kind of experience was inconceivable for any living being, even for Luo Fan. It could even be said that any living being in this state would have their spirit split and their will collapse. Fortunately, the connection between Luo Fan's main body and the spiritual sense avatar had become faintly discernible when the spiritual sense avatar had transformed into 10,000 spirit. Although these experiences could be said to be Luo Fan's own experiences, they were not transmitted to his mind. From Luo Fan's point of view, everything in the vast thousand worlds was not much different from what happened in other worlds. Only after an unknown amount of time, when there were living beings in the great thousand world that could break through their limits and recover the will of the spiritual sense doppelganger, would all living beings in the great thousand world gather together and reform into the spiritual sense doppelganger. At that time, the power of all living beings would be the power of the spiritual sense doppelganger, the wisdom of all living beings would be the wisdom of the spiritual sense doppelganger, and the memories of all living beings would naturally be the memories of the spiritual sense doppelganger. In that case, how would all these strange experiences have any impact on Luo Fan? Although the prospect is wonderful, the time needed is too long. I'm afraid that I might not be able to reach this step even after the end of the Age of Chaos. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. He could imagine that if the spiritual sense doppelganger could be condensed again in the future, it would definitely possess earth-shattering abilities. It might even reach the pinnacle of the Khanate Grand Luo realm, and it might even reach an unbelievable level that was infinitely close to the Sage realm. But judging from the development of the sense doppelganger over the past tens of millions of years, it would be extremely difficult for any living beings to reach that step. that it would probably take millions of years. In that case, even if he had the ability to freely control time in the Great Thousand World, it would probably take billions of years. At that time, the Dharma ending age would probably be over, and the saints would come out. Who knew what kind of incredible upheaval would happen to the earth and the universe? Countless thoughts flashed through his mind, and Luo Fan instantly decided on his course of action. It takes too long for the Great Thousand World to develop to such a stage, and I can't wait that long. Since that's the case, I'll speed up its development. With that thought, Luo Fan turned into an old Taoist. The grand heavenly immortal behind his head also changed its form, turning into a strange jade that slowly revolved behind his head. As he changed, an indescribably powerful aura instantly emanated from his body, filling every inch of space in the Great Thousand World. This aura was filled with boundless majesty, boundless nobility, boundless antiquity, and incomparably profound. It was as if the lofty great Tao had directly manifested itself. Along with this aura, the laws of the entire vast thousand domains changed slightly. This kind of change was so mysterious that it could not be described in words. After the transformation, Luo Fan retracted his aura and did not change back to his original appearance. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His movements were extremely natural and seemed to be extremely slow, but in fact, he was extremely fast as he strode towards the sky. In the blink of an eye, he had entered the boundless starry sky above. Arriving in the boundless darkness of the starry sky, he casually waved his hand, and a huge cloud of light formed, covering a radius of 100 miles. After the cloud of light formed, an incomparably ancient stone house that gave off an ancient and boundless aura condensed above it. The stone house was not big, only about 100 feet in circumference. There was a plaque hanging on the door, and two strange words were engraved on it: Tao Palace. The language used in these two words was extremely mysterious. It was not any known language, but a language that was similar to runes. It was a language that was developed from runes. Aside from the huge amount of information contained in each word, the greatest advantage of this language was that it could be seen directly. Any living being could understand the meaning of each word with a single glance, and there was no need for them to have originally learned this language. Just like the two words Tao Palace, the word Tao gave off an all-encompassing and omnipotent aura. With a single glance, one could tell that this word corresponded to the great Tao. As for the word palace, it gave off an all-encompassing aura, allowing one to understand that it corresponded to an all-encompassing palace. After the stone house appeared, Luo Fan did not stop. With a thought, he stepped into it. The stone house looked to be 100 feet in radius from the outside, but the space inside was not like that. Instead, it would naturally adjust according to the number of people that entered. Thus, when Luo Fan entered, it would naturally be 100 feet in radius. However, when more living beings entered, the space would become larger, and no matter how many living beings entered, it would not feel crowded at all. There was a stone platform opposite the stone house. On it, there was a futon made of unknown materials, emitting a quiet and focused aura. Luo Fan did not stop. He took a step onto the platform, sat cross-legged on the futon, and slowly closed his eyes. In his sea of consciousness, the endless information that he had received from watching the sword lunatic began to be released at an unhurried speed, flowing through his mind. Under the starry sky, as time passed, more and more living beings were gradually born. These living beings came in all shapes and sizes. Some had appeared in hundreds of civilizations in the past, and some had never appeared in the vast thousand domains. There was a great variety of them. However, no matter what kind of living beings they belonged to, or how strong or weak they were, when they were born, they naturally knew some basic cultivation methods that were most suitable for their race. At the same time, they clearly knew that there was a Tao Palace in the depths of the starry sky. As long as they could cultivate the basic cultivation methods to a certain level, they could go to the Tao Palace in the depths of the starry sky and obtain incredible power. In the end, they could even live as long as the heavens. Under these circumstances, the entire vast 1,000 domains fell into a frenzy of cultivation. Almost all living beings wholeheartedly cultivated the moment they were born, hoping that one day they could go to the depths of the starry sky and obtain supreme power and endless lifespan. As a result, the battles in the vast 1,000 domains became even more tragic. Cultivators were strong living beings, and a civilization where everyone cultivated was naturally a strong civilization. The various battles in such a strong civilization would naturally far surpass the internal battles of other civilizations. Therefore, according to the development of this civilization, in just a few tens of thousands of years, the battles in this civilization would be comparable to all the battles that happened in the hundreds of civilizations in the past tens of millions of years. Under these circumstances, only a few hundred years later, the first batch of living beings achieved something similar to the basic cultivation method. They entered the depths of the starry sky together and finally found the Tao Palace in the depths of the starry sky. For these living beings to be able to cultivate to such an extent, they were naturally intelligent people. Even the cultivation methods that they cultivated were modified, deduced, and changed from the cultivation methods that had originally appeared in their minds. When these living beings arrived at the Tao Palace, they were immediately shocked by the two words, Tao Palace. The arrogance that had arisen in their hearts was instantly shattered. They no longer had any doubts that the Tao Palace might contain what they sought. When they arrived at the Tao Palace, Luo Fan had already woken up from the process of continuously comprehending the various mysteries of the creation of the world by the sword lunatic for hundreds of years. He directly summoned that group of living beings into the Tao Palace and taught them cultivation methods that led to the innate great Luo according to their situation. After giving them some pointers, he sent them away. That group of living beings was naturally inexplicably grateful to Luo Fan. After they left, they spread the word that the Tao Palace had a benevolent and knowledgeable Supreme Tao Lord in it, and that it contained infinite Tao technique. As long as they reached the Tao Palace, they would be able to receive the teachings. As these living beings spread the word, more and more living beings made the Tao Palace their goal to strive for. Just like that, more and more living beings reached their goal and arrived at the Palace of Tao. In order to promote the development of this great 1,000 world, Luo Fan did not reject any of the living beings. He taught them cultivation methods that led straight to the innate golden Luo, and then sent them away after giving them some pointers. These cultivation methods that led to the innate great Luo were created according to each living being's situation. Other living beings, even those of the same race, could not cultivate such cultivation methods that targeted others and led to the innate great Luo. Only by personally going to the Tao Palace could they obtain the cultivation methods that targeted themselves. This situation seemed inconceivable, but it was actually very easy to understand. In fact, if it were any other living beings on Earth or in the universe, Luo Fan would not be able to directly give them cultivation methods that were not targeted at their own situation and led to the innate great Luo. That was because to become a innate great Luo, one needed to understand the mysteries of the great Luo. Without understanding the mysteries of the great Luo, one would not be able to become a innate great Luo no matter how much power one cultivated. The mysteries of the great Luo were a mystery that could not be described with words. If one wanted to understand the mysteries of the great Luo, one could only rely on one's own comprehension to go against the flow and trace the Tao from the surface of the universe. Only then would one be able to do it. All cultivation methods were like scratching an itch in this process, and could not be of any real use. In this vast 1,000 world, the reason why Luo Fan could do this was because all living beings in this vast 1,000 world were Luo Fan's consciousness clones. In essence, they were all Luo Fan's spiritual sense clones. To Luo Fan's consciousness clones, their essence was already on the same level as the innate great Luo. Therefore, it could be said that the countless living beings in the vast thousand world were essentially on the same level as the innate great Luo. If they wanted to become the innate great Luo, they only needed to use some methods to activate the essence that was originally hidden in the depths of their bodies. To Luo Fan, how difficult could it be to activate the essence that was hidden in the depths of their bodies? He only needed to glance at them and he could create thousands of techniques. It was naturally extremely easy for him to casually give one to those living beings. Of course, it was also because the technique that allowed these living beings to become the innate great Luo was essentially activating the essence that was hidden in their bodies. Therefore, this method was independent for each living being. Other living beings naturally couldn't activate the essence that was hidden in their bodies. This was why the technique that Luo Fan passed down to other living beings of the same race could not allow them to become the innate great Luo. However, even if the techniques that Luo Fan passed down could not allow other living beings to become the innate great Luo, it was enough to greatly improve their cultivation, strength, and abilities. Therefore, when the techniques that Luo Fan passed down were spread, the cultivation standard of the entire vast thousand world was greatly improved. More and more living beings obtained the qualifications to go to the Tao Palace to receive the techniques that Luo Fan passed down. However, there were also more and more living beings who did not care about such qualifications. After all, not all living beings sought to become the innate great Luo. Perhaps some only wanted to be free and unfettered in the world, some only wanted to obtain greater combat strength, and some did not care about anything else. All they wanted was to live a good life, and it did not matter when they died or how much power they possessed. It was at this time that Luo Fan raised the qualifications to go to the Tao Palace in a timely manner. He reduced the qualifications to the point where they could not find the Tao Palace unless they reached the pinnacle of the innate great Luo realm. When the qualifications became like that, the number of living beings who found the Tao Palace naturally decreased by many-fold. There were only a handful of them. This was only natural. While Luo Fan did not hold back on guiding every living being who found the Tao Palace, he did not hide any secrets to become the innate great Luo. However, there were very, very few living beings who could become the innate great Luo. After all, the innate great Luo was the final realm below the Saint realm. It was not far from being omnipotent. One could imagine how difficult it was to become the innate great Luo. Even if these living beings were only awakening their extremely hidden essence, it was still a different way to become the innate great Luo. Even if it was thousands of times easier than achieving it out of nothing, it was still an extremely difficult task. Under such circumstances, out of the thousands of living beings who received the techniques that Luo Fan passed down, only one would be able to become the innate great Luo. In other words, the living beings who were at the pinnacle below the innate great Luo could be considered as the group that stood at the pinnacle of the vast thousand world. As for the living beings that stood at the pinnacle of the world, their ambition could not be overestimated. That was why when Luo Fan raised the qualifications, there were very few people who went to the Tao Palace. Luo Fan did not mind this change at all. The reason he set up the Tao Palace was to raise the standard of cultivation in the vast thousand world. On the other hand, he naturally didn't pass down the cultivation technique that could bring living beings to life for the sake of creating innate golden immortal realm cultivators. Innate golden immortal realm cultivators that could bring living beings to life were millions of times weaker than true innate golden immortal realm cultivators, so how could they be worthy of his expectations? The reason he passed down the cultivation techniques was so that the living beings in the vast thousand world would be able to comprehend the fundamental principles of these cultivation techniques and their own essence. From there, they would be able to become the innate great Luo without cultivating these cultivation techniques. At that time, it would be equivalent to the cultivator breaking through the shackles, finding himself, and comprehending the origin. Naturally, he would regain the consciousness of Luo Fan's spiritual clone. At that moment, it would be the time when Luo Fan's merit would be complete. This living being would directly absorb all the living beings in the vast thousand world and completely form the spiritual clone. Moreover, because it would absorb the power, will, and memories of all the living beings, the spiritual clone would possess incredible power, incredible divine ability, and incredible wisdom. It might even surpass his main body in the Earth universe in one fell swoop. From there, it would nourish the main body, allowing the main body to possess the same power, divine ability, and wisdom. This kind of expectation was obviously very random. He could only wait for an opportunity that would appear at any time. Perhaps a living being like him would appear today, or perhaps it would only appear after hundreds of millions of years. But no matter what, compared to ignoring everything and allowing the vast thousand world to naturally evolve and improve to the final requirement, time could only be faster and not slower. After all, in the process of waiting for this living being to appear, the vast thousand world was still evolving and improving. Even if he could never wait for that living being to appear, at most, he could only wait for the vast thousand world to naturally evolve and naturally raise the requirement. Compared to ignoring everything, there was no difference. Therefore, what Luo Fan did could be said to be beneficial without any harm. Why not? As for whether there was a moral burden for the living being to absorb all the living beings in the vast thousand world, this was nonsense. All the living beings in the vast thousand world were Luo Fan himself. The floating in the water was Luo Fan. The divine dragon roaming in the sky was Luo Fan. The people in the world who worked hard to survive, deceived, attacked, and loved each other were Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, the living being absorbing all the living beings in the vast thousand world was equivalent to integrating his countless mixed memories. Why would there be any moral burden? Chapter 653. While Luo Fan was working hard to improve his cultivation level in the vast thousand worlds of the Earth universe, in the untainted land far away from the Earth universe, the changes Luo Fan had been dreaming of were taking place. Somewhere in the endless starry sky, in the mysterious void Wuji Palace, Luo Fan suddenly opened his eyes, which were entangled with two strange gray Mengmeng existences. These two strange existences were none other than the chaotic state of Hun. In these two chaotic states of Hun, there was a longsword constantly slashing in them. Every time the longsword slashed and slashed, it triggered some mysterious changes in the two chaotic states of Hun. And the mysterious changes in the two chaotic states of Hun naturally revealed countless incredible mysteries, transmitted almost endless information, and displayed endless incredible mysteries of the universe and the true meaning of space-time. Shockingly, this scene was the scene when Sword Lunatic split the heavens and earth apart before Luo Fan's clone in the Earth universe had all his memories about Lunatic Swordsman. He had passed all his memories about Lunatic Swordsman to his main body in the primordial world through a mysterious and unfathomable spiritual connection. This allowed his main body to return his memories after they had been erased. It also allowed his main body to witness Lunatic Swordsman creating the world with his own eyes. Creating a new world in the chaotic state of Hun was a supreme achievement no matter which world it was. When a living being could create the world in the chaotic state of Hun, he had already broken through the shackles of the world, breaking through the limitation that all the Tao he had comprehended and the cultivation method belonged to a single world and could only exert its power in a single world. At this level, all the mysteries and principles that a living being comprehended would be equally useful to any living being in any other world. As long as they could comprehend them, they would naturally be able to directly apply them and obtain the most direct breakthrough. Although Lunatic's sword could not essentially achieve this achievement of creating the world in the chaotic state of Hun, he could rely on his strong understanding of the way of the sword to cross the space-time of the Earth universe, and thus obtain the ability to barely survive in the chaotic state of Hun for a moment. This ability doesn't really do much. However, he possessed great wisdom, perseverance, and determination. He actually abandoned everything in order to create a new world in the chaotic state of Hun. Even if he failed in the end, he still managed to create an extremely unstable spacetime in the process. Although there was a huge gap between that and the achievement of freely splitting open the world in the chaotic state of Hun, it still had that meaning. In other words, at the very last moment of his life, when that extremely unstable space was opened, Lunatic Swordsman had reached that realm. Although it was only for an instant, it was enough for Luo Fan. At this moment, the scene of Lunatic Swordsman's creation of the world was constantly circulating in his mind. Almost at every moment, the boundless origin of the universe, which had not been contaminated by any special world, was circulating in his mind. In a trance, Luo Fan only felt that the most origin of the grand Luo mysteries, which took him endless time to comprehend in the past, was no longer concealed in front of him. Almost at every moment, he felt that his understanding of the grand Luo mysteries was undergoing a fundamental improvement. Faintly, a sense of great perfection was slowly taking shape in his mind. The mysteries contained in the creation of the world were almost endless. Even the innate Grand Luo could not fully comprehend it. Only those who had reached the Saint Realm and above would have a chance to fully comprehend it. Although Luo Fan was already at the peak of the primordial unity gold number, he still could not fully comprehend the Grand Luo mysteries. There was still a big gap between him and the innate Grand Luo. It was impossible for him to fully comprehend all the mysteries contained in the process of Lunatic Sword's creation of the world. Therefore, to him, although the moment when the Lunatic Sword succeeded in splitting the heavens and earth apart was an extremely short moment, no matter how he tried to comprehend it over and over again, he would always obtain the profoundness that he had not been able to comprehend before. Every time he saw the process of Lunatic Sword's creation of the world, there was a huge difference from before. It was as if it was a process of creation of the world. The mysteries were almost indescribable in words. Luo Fan was so infatuated with the moment when Lunatic Sword created the world that all the changes in the outside world seemed to no longer exist to him at this moment. Even the grand Luo mysteries that he had been dreaming of for many years had become secondary and could no longer occupy too much position in his mind. In this case, time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of thousands of years had passed. Unknowingly, Luo Fan's entire body was filled with an indescribable aura of perfection. This kind of aura of perfection was flawless and all-encompassing. His entire figure, every breath, every shake of his body, and every movement of his hair revealed an indescribable sense of perfection. It was as if every breath, every shake, and every movement of his hair was the most perfect and perfect realm that all living beings in the infinite universe and the infinite heaven and earth could achieve. The aura was so dense that it could be imagined that as long as Luo Fan's mind returned, he would naturally comprehend the Grand Luo mysteries and directly obtain the Grand Luo Dao fruit that he had been dreaming of. However, this goal that Luo Fan had been pursuing tirelessly for tens of thousands of years was nothing to Luo Fan at this moment. Even though he had a clear understanding of this, he was still unwilling to spend even a little bit of time to prove the Grand Luo Dao fruit. Instead, he still devoted all his attention to the scene when Lunatic Sword created the world, constantly comprehending the mysteries within. Even after hundreds of thousands of years, Luo Fan's comprehension of the mysteries of this moment still had not exhausted all its mysteries. He had repeatedly comprehended the scene at that moment countless times, but even after hundreds of thousands of years, he could still comprehend many mysteries that he had never known before from the scene at that moment. His cultivation realm was improving almost visibly every moment. On the other hand, it was precisely this profound feeling that allowed him to realize the golden immortal Tao fruit that he yearned for even in his dreams with just a fraction of his attention, and it would allow his cultivation to improve by thousands or even tens of thousands of times. However, He wasn't willing to waste that fraction of his attention, and he wasn't willing to allow that fraction of his attention to leave this state of ceaseless improvement and comprehension. Chapter 654. On this day, Luo Fan's body suddenly shook, and his eyes, which had been closed for hundreds of thousands of years, slowly opened. Text starter. No ads, full text, updates in his eyes. There were countless strange lines that were crazily swimming, drawing out a mysterious and unbelievable trajectory. It was as if he was evolving some kind of supreme mystery, as if he was the projection of the supreme great Tao. It's a pity that I haven't become Hun Yuan. My comprehension of this mystery is limited. Luo Fan let out a long sigh. At this moment, his comprehension of the scene of sword lunatics splitting the heavens and the earth apart had reached a limit. Every time he comprehended it, he would be able to see some new profundities that he hadn't discovered in the countless previous comprehensions, but these new profundities were profound to the point that they completely exceeded the limits of his understanding. Although he knew that he had not exhausted all the mysteries of the split second when the world was created, he could not gain anything no matter what. He only felt that his mind was gradually filled with endless and completely incomprehensible information. It made his thinking speed become more and more stagnant, making him feel that his thoughts were turning slower and slower, and gradually seemed to even gradually lose the ability to think. This situation made him gradually understand. What he had obtained in the past hundreds of thousands of years had reached the limit of what he could obtain at this moment. If there was no fundamental improvement in his cultivation, he would not be able to comprehend anything new from the scene of that moment. In other words, at this point, although the scene in that instant still contained endless mysteries, no matter how much time he spent comprehending it, he would not be able to obtain anything new that he needed from it. Because of this, at this moment, Luo Fan broke out of that state, and his mind returned to his body. After a leisurely sigh, the Tai Dao fruit in Luo Fan's dantian trembled, and instantly underwent a mysterious change. The entire Tai Dao fruit seemed to have changed into a new form without any transformation process. This new form was very different from the previous Tai Dao fruit. It was as if the two had no relationship at all, and the two completely belonged to two different systems, built with different foundations. This new existence was so mysterious that it could not be described with a specific form. It was like a disc, like a sphere, and even more like a square. Almost any shape that could be thought of could be seen through a certain angle. The entire mysterious existence seemed to be producing all kinds of incredible changes at every moment, but also seemed to be fixed there for eternity. This existence seemed to have no boundaries, and it was separated from the surrounding void in an extremely strange way. The separation seemed extremely blurry, as if it had become one with the surrounding void, with Luo Fan's dantian, with his body, and even with the outside world, with the endless starry sky outside the world, and with the untainted world under the endless starry sky. No means could be used to separate them. A mysterious great perfection aura emanated from this existence, filling the entire dantian, then the entire body, and then spread out, filling the entire strange hall, the entire Wuji palace, and even the entire endless starry sky, and every inch of the void of the entire untainted world. Countless tiny three-dimensional talismans, which seemed to be fixed since ancient times, and seemed to be changing in hundreds of millions of mysterious forms at every moment, rushed out of this strange existence, gathered into a torrent and swam in his dantian in an extremely mysterious way. The number of these three-dimensional talismans kept increasing. In just a few breaths, they had filled the entire dantian, then rushed out through the 129,600 meridians around his dantian, and instantly flowed all over his body, causing all the meridians in his body to be filled with this mysterious three-dimensional talisman, no matter how small they were. After the meridians in his body were filled with these three-dimensional talismans still did not stop growing, but directly broke through the shackles, continuously breaking through from the inside to the outside. Inwards, they broke through a mysterious place in his body, directly entered the world of his sea of consciousness, and constantly replaced everything in the world of his sea of consciousness, constantly making the world of his sea of consciousness real. Outwards, these three-dimensional talismans broke through the meridians, entered the muscles, bones, and organs, and finally reached the hair of his head, causing every part of his body to be filled with this extremely complicated and mysterious three-dimensional talisman. These three-dimensional talismans were none other than Luo Fan's Dharma power units. At this moment, compared to before, Luo Fan's Dharma power units had undergone a tremendous change. Besides the fact that their form had become countless times more profound, their number had also undergone a qualitative change compared to before. These Dharma power units had broken through the limit of numbers, reaching a realm that couldn't even be described with numbers. And the existence that appeared in Luo Fan's Dantian and replaced the Grand Unity Tao fruit was naturally the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit that had transformed from the Grand Unity Tao fruit. It was precisely because of the boundless harvest that Luo Fan obtained from comprehending the scene of Sword Madman's creation that his cultivation had unknowingly broken through the shackles of Grand Unity, directly comprehended the profundities of the Grand Unity Tao fruit, and naturally attained the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit. As soon as the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit was formed, Luo Fan felt that his entire mind had started to improve infinitely. In the blink of an eye, he had reached a realm that he could not have imagined in the past, and he was looking down at everything in the universe from a boundless height. At this moment, everything that he had experienced in his life flashed through his mind at an unimaginable speed. This speed was extremely fast. In just a few breaths of time, everything that he had experienced for who knows how many billions of years had passed through his mind. Even the slightest thing had passed through his mind. Moreover, this kind of story wasn't just a rough outline of the process, but every minute detail was not left out. Even with his mind that was standing at a boundless height, even the slightest detail had been reanalyzed, rededuced, and recomprehended countless times. In just a few breaths of time, Luo Fan seemed to have experienced hundreds of billions of years again. After this change, his half-opened eyes naturally revealed a sense of great enlightenment. The perfect aura that came from his soul, from his body, and from the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit instantly penetrated deep into his life source, into every bit of his mind, every thought and every piece of his memory. Everything that belonged to him, regardless of whether it was real or fake, emitted the perfect aura from inside out. That was the aura of the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit. Chapter 655. Shaoyan Literature Chapter 695. Zenith Heaven Tao Fruit 2. Luo Fan floated above the platform inside the strange palace. The consummate aura on his body was rising infinitely, constantly spreading to the infinite distance. Genius only needs 3 seconds to remember. The Tao fruit he had attained should have been constructed from magical power unit. In other words, when the Tao fruit existed, the magical power units were an inseparable part of the Tao fruit. When magic power appears, the Tao fruit will not be able to take shape. But at this moment, his golden immortal Tao fruit had broken through this restriction. The Tao fruit of Zenith Heaven existed in an incomparably complete and mysterious way in his Dantian, but his body was still filled with endless magical power units, forming a vast and boundless magical power. Moreover, this magic power was still increasing at every moment. Luo Fan's sea of consciousness was boundlessly vast. Before he'd attained the golden immortal Tao fruit, his sea of consciousness was already extremely profound, and it was even capable of producing boundless energy for Luo Fan to utilize. However, the primordial qi was only born in his sea of consciousness after all. It was a kind of primordial qi that was in between reality and illusion. To Luo Fan, it was real, but to the untainted land, it was an illusion. This kind of vital energy could be used by Luo Fan and could support Luo Fan in doing countless unimaginable things, but it could not leave his body and exist in the outside world. However, this situation started to gradually change after Luo Fan attained the golden immortal Tao fruit. The unit of Luo Fan's power was a three-dimensional talisman, a mysterious three-dimensional talisman that was created by the inexhaustible power of the outside world through countless unimaginable refinements. These three-dimensional talismans were extremely profound, and they contained unbelievable profundities. They contained Luo Fan's various comprehensions of the supreme great Tao of the primordial world, and they contained boundless might. If the world of the Sea of Consciousness was completely constructed by these magical power units, then the essence of the world of the Sea of Consciousness would naturally undergo an earth-shaking change. That feeling of being in between reality and illusion would completely disappear. The Sea of Consciousness would become a completely real world from then on. The primordial energy in the Sea of Consciousness world would also break through the restrictions of Luo Fan's body. It could only exist in Luo Fan's body and could only be consumed by Luo Fan, but could not appear in the outside world of the primordial world. It would become the same as the various primordial qi that existed in the primordial world. Therefore, it could be used by other living beings and increase the essence of other living beings. It could even change the supreme great Tao of the primordial world. It was obvious that it had turned from illusion to reality. In essence, there was already a sublimation LT/AGT. However, even though the significance of this change was so significant, it was still quite difficult for this change to be completely successful. After all, although Luo Fan's magical power units contained endless mysteries, endless truths of the universe, and incredible power, they were extremely small existences. To construct a vast and boundless world with such tiny magical power units, the number of magical power units needed was so huge that it almost exceeded the limits of imagination of all living beings. If Luo Fan wanted the magical power units to completely replace everything in the Sea of Consciousness, even if the magical power units were growing rapidly, the time needed would be at least hundreds of millions of years. Just like at this very moment, although Luo Fan had an infinite amount of magical power units pouring into his Sea of Consciousness, he could only change the nature of a few grains of sand and stones in his Sea of Consciousness. There was still a long way to go before he could truly cause a major change in his Sea of Consciousness. Luo Fan floated in the void, and the look of enlightenment in his eyes gradually faded. His eyes seemed to have returned to how they were before the transformation, but in the depths of his eyes, there was an indescribable expression. It was as if no matter how incredible the changes in the outside world were, they were no longer secrets to him, they could no longer move him, and they could no longer affect his mind in the slightest. The great perfection aura around him also gradually faded at this moment, and finally, no trace of its existence could be found, as if the great perfection aura did not exist at all. However, although this kind of aura had disappeared, Luo Fan's entire person looked completely different from before. This difference was so subtle and mysterious that at first glance, Luo Fan seemed to be no different from before, as if nothing had happened. However, upon closer inspection, one would find that all the details around him were so perfect, as if the most perfect human form in the universe should be his current appearance. It was as if other than his current figure, his current appearance, his current posture, and his current expression, no matter how perfect an existence was, even if it was slightly different from these, it was not truly perfect, not truly perfect. This kind of perfection, seemed to have exhausted the mysteries of perfection and perfection in the primordial world. It was as if his entire body was explaining the perfection and perfection itself. A faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. He took a deep breath, and in an instant, a vast chaotic aura appeared out of nowhere around him. It continuously poured into his body with his breath, directly into the Daluo fruit of ways, causing the units of energy produced by the Daluo fruit of ways to instantly multiply in speed. The amount of chaotic aura that surged into his body with a single breath was astonishing. If it was piled up in one place, it would be enough to form a liquefied chaotic aura ocean that was thousands of kilometers wide and several dozen kilometers deep. However, when he absorbed such a huge amount of chaotic aura, it did not cause any damage to the surrounding environment, nor did a huge vortex of energy appear. It was as if the vast chaotic aura had been temporarily produced by the primordial world for Luo Fan. Just as Luo Fan took a deep breath, the entire primordial world seemed to shrink slightly. No matter where they were in the primordial world, as long as they had reached the level of an individual immortal, they could feel that the primordial world seemed to be compressed by an indescribable force at this moment. It was as if the space and time of the primordial world had been suddenly pressed down. The feeling of being compressed by the entire primordial world disappeared as Luo Fan took a deep breath. After the feeling of being compressed by the entire primordial world disappeared, the living beings who had reached the realm of individual immortals, no matter where they were in the primordial world, found that the concentration of primordial chi in the primordial world seemed to have increased slightly. This growth was so subtle and so strange that almost all living beings who could sense this change could not believe their own senses. They could only treat it as their own illusions. In fact, their feelings were naturally real and unmistakable. Luo Fan's breath really made the primordial chi in the primordial world increase slightly. F*ck